Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where warmth is never guaranteed, and every breath might bite a little deeper than the last. You're going to learn how the old school mountain men, those flintlock-toting, fur-draped legends of the American frontier, survived bone-deep cold in ways we've mostly forgotten. And fair warning, you probably won't survive this. Not without your phone, a heated blanket, and at least 3 complaints about how your thermostat is off by 2 degrees. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, you're out there, somewhere between the Great Divide and the icy teeth of the Wind River Range. It's midwinter, 1832. You're wearing buckskin, not Gore-Tex. You've got flint and steel, no Bic lighter. Your beard's frozen in spikes. Your toes are somewhere between tingly and, are they even still attached? And before you do anything else, before you unpack, before you look for food, before you even think about sleep, what's the first thing you absolutely must do? Fire. Always fire. Not the cozy kind you're imagining right now with marshmallows and stories. This is survival fire. Life or death fire. The mountain men knew, with the kind of certainty only misery can teach you, that the very first priority in deadly cold is heat. Not just because it keeps you from freezing, which it does, but because it makes everything else possible. Heat lets you melt snow for water, thaw your hands enough to use them, dry the moisture out of your powder horn. If you don't have fire, you're on a ticking clock, and that clock is measuring how long it takes before your brain forgets how to tie a knot. And here's the thing most modern folks miss. You don't start building a fire when you need one. That's already too late. Mountain men gathered tinder as they walked, always on the lookout for dry bark, dead grass under snow, or resinous pine knots that would burn hot. They'd sometimes even carry their own kindling with them in a pouch. Imagine stuffing your pockets with birch bark just to stay alive. Now, making fire the old way isn't a matter of snapping your fingers and watching the flames roar. It's a process, slow, stubborn, and deeply humbling. Flint, steel, and charcloth if you're lucky. Bow drill if you're desperate and borderline masochistic. The mountain men sometimes used gunpowder to jumpstart the process, trickling it into dry lint or a bird's nest of fibrous plant material and igniting it with a spark. Risky, but effective. Fire is so important that if your hands are too frozen to strike a flint, you're in serious trouble. There are stories of trappers holding fire-starting gear between their thighs to keep it warm enough to work. Think about that next time your Zippo won't light. Here's a fringe trick that sounds like fiction but pops up in old journals and passed down lore. Carrying coals. After breaking camp, a mountain man might wrap embers from last night's fire in bark, moss, or fungus like horsehoof or chaga and keep it in a pouch or bundled in his pack. With a bit of air and dryness, the ember could smoulder for hours, maybe even days, saving precious time and energy the next night. Fire on demand, 1830s style, beats rubbing sticks together when you're one frostbite away from losing a toe. And speaking of frostbite, there's a fascinating little side note here. Some researchers and historians debate just how much cold these men actually endured, and how often. Yes, the Rockies and the Sierras got brutally cold, but did these guys just camp out in it for weeks? Or did they know the microclimates and sheltered spots well enough to avoid the worst? It's still up for discussion. Some say the mountain men weren't quite the ice-braving maniacs we picture. They were just very, very good at reading the land and knowing when to hide. Others argue that they absolutely did rough it, living through blizzards in makeshift camps with not much more than fire and grit. Either way, their understanding of fire was about more than technique. It was philosophy. It was preparation. It was everything. Now imagine this. It's just before dusk. You've tracked a beaver line through knee-high powder. You haven't eaten since morning, and the wind has a voice now. It hisses through the trees like something alive. You're tired, hungry, and starting to shiver just a little too hard. Every bone in your body says sit down, rest, close your eyes just for a minute. But that's the trap. That's the cold whispering. The old trappers had a rule. You don't stop until the fire is burning, no matter how tired you are, no matter how dark it gets, no matter how tempting it is to lie down. First, you gather. Then, you build. Then, and only then, do you sit. It's almost a ritual. You find a spot with some natural windbreak, maybe a big rock or a downed pine. You scrape clear the snow to bare earth if you can. If not, you build up a platform with logs or stones so your fire doesn't sink and drown. You arrange your tinder, maybe bark you fluffed into a nest, dry pine needles, or even pocket-dried moss. Strike the flint, try again, and again. Finally a spark catches, you blow softly, you hear the tiniest crackle, the ember grows, the smoke twirls, you feed it kindling. Slowly, carefully, it becomes fire. And just like that, the danger retreats a little. Not gone, never gone, but held at bay by orange light and radiant heat. Fire was more than warmth to these men. It was companionship, insurance, proof that you still had your wits about you. And maybe the most important thing fire did, it gave you time. Time to think, time to plan, time to remember that you're not dead yet. And with luck, you won't be tomorrow either. So tonight, as you cozy up with your blankets and climate control and flickering LED candles, remember that somewhere, long ago, a man was warming his hands over a tiny flame in a snow-sheltered clearing, and that fire, small as it was everything. It doesn't matter how tough you are. If you don't dress right, winter will humble you fast. Mountain men figured this out pretty quickly, usually after a few near-death experiences, or watching some other poor soul freeze halfway through a trail. Cold isn't just about temperature, it's about moisture, wind, exposure, and especially your own dumb choices. And one of the smartest things they learned, often the hard way, was how to layer. Not just put on more clothes kind of layering. We're talking a full strategy here. You've probably heard the old wisdom, layer like an onion. Well, mountain men did exactly that, minus the synthetic fabrics and fancy insulation. What they had were natural materials: wool, fur, leather, and buckskin, and they used them like a survival kit you wear on your body. Let's start at the base. Wool was a favourite when they could get it, usually in the form of long johns or thick socks. Why wool? Because it keeps insulating even when wet. That might not sound like a big deal until you're knee-deep in snow and your boots are soaked from a creek you thought was frozen. Cotton, by the way, was almost universally avoided in cold climates. Mountain men might not have known the term hypothermia, but they knew cotton kills. It soaks up moisture and holds it close, turning your shirt into a chilled sponge just when you need it to keep you alive. Over that base layer came buckskin, deer or elk hide, usually tanned with the brain of the animal itself. Yes, really, it's called brain tanning. Was supple, strong, and breathed just enough to keep sweat from building up too fast. Buckskin shirts and leggings were like second skin, protective but breathable, and surprisingly comfortable once broken in. Plus, they didn't rip easy. That mattered when you were climbing through thickets or wrestling with icy snares. On top of that, if things got really cold, came the fur. Beaver pelts, bison robes, even bear skins. Whatever they could trap or trade for, they'd use to wrap up like walking wilderness blankets. And the key wasn't just to wear fur, it was to wear it right. Fur in, fur out, fur-lined hoods, mitts, moccasins, each had its logic. For sleeping, fur in was the norm, warmer, closer to the skin. For walking, sometimes fur out helped block wind and shed snow, and mittens, not gloves, were the gold standard. Keeping your fingers together means conserving more heat, even if it makes firing a flintlock feel like threading a needle with oven mitts on. Here's a quirky bit of historical fashion trivia. Mountain men often wore their shirts tucked into their leggings, with a belt over both to seal in warmth and keep out snow. That's right, belt over shirt and pants. Function beat fashion every time, and some would even stuff extra fur between their layers, creating makeshift insulation pads that shifted as they moved. Imagine walking around all day with raccoon tail insulation stuffed down your shirt. Not exactly Patagonia chic, but it worked. And then there's footwear, the great debate of boots versus moccasins. We'll get deeper into that later, but for now, just know that heavy leather boots often froze solid overnight. Moccasins, made of soft leather and often lined with fur, could be dried more easily and didn't constrict circulation. And that's another point mountain men understood that modern folk sometimes forget. Tight equals cold. If your clothes or boots are cutting off blood flow, you're helping the cold take your toes. Of course, even the best gear isn't perfect if you don't manage it properly. Mountain men were religious about drying their clothes when they could. Every night, if they had fire, they'd hang up their damp layers nearby, not close enough to scorch, just close enough to steam. A wet shirt left untouched overnight could turn into a leatherboard by morning. Or worse, freeze into a brittle mess you'd have to thaw just to wear, And let's not even get started on what frozen pants feel like going back on in the dark. Now here's a fringe practice that sounds a little wild. Sleeping nearly naked. Not always, and not in the open, but when inside a well-insulated shelter or a well-blanketed bedroll, some trappers would strip down to their underlayer and hang the rest to dry while they slept. The idea? You're warmer letting your body heat escape directly into the bedding, instead of being trapped in damp clothes that hold cold against your skin. It sounds backwards, and it sure feels backwards at first, but done right, it meant waking up dry and alive, not clammy and shivering. Of course, modern science has some debates with all of this. One of the biggest? Whether natural materials like buckskin and fur really perform better than synthetics in extreme cold. Some scholars argue that if mountain men had access to down jackets and Gore-Tex, they would have dropped fur like a hot rock. Others push back, pointing out that traditional clothing worked in ways modern stuff still struggles to match, especially in variable wet-dry-cold cycles like you find in the Rockies. It's not just about warmth, it's about breathability, durability, and how things perform over weeks in the field, not just on one snowshoe hike. But the heart of the matter was always this: layer smart and adjust often. You'd strip down while working, yes, even in sub-zero weather, just to avoid sweating. Then layer back up as soon as you stopped. It was a constant dance with your own body heat. Get too warm, you'll sweat, get wet and chill fast. Get too cold, you're useless. Numb hands can't light fires or skin game or hold reins, so you listen to your body, something mountain men did better than most of us today. They didn't have fitness trackers or thermal imaging. They had sensation. They had instinct. They had scars, probably. And here's something soft and kind of lovely amid the brutality of all this. They learned from each other. From native peoples, from fellow trappers, from trial and cold error. The way they layered up wasn't just smart. It was communal knowledge, passed around like hot coffee on a freezing morning. If a trapper made it through a brutal winter with all his fingers and toes intact, you bet the others asked how he did it. And maybe, just maybe, that guy had figured out how to keep the snow out of his collar and the wind out of his moccasins. So next time you're layering up for a walk to the corner store and debating whether you need a scarf and a hoodie, just remember, you're already softer than a man who survived a Wyoming blizzard wrapped in dead animal skins, with nothing but instinct and a flickering fire to keep him company. The night wraps around you like a frozen blanket, and the trees creak like old bones. You've got a fire going, small, low, but alive, and your layers are holding the heat close. Good. That gives you a chance. But you know what else you need to survive the night out here, far from cabins and towns and anything resembling comfort? A rifle. And not just for hunting, not just for defense. You need it for warmth. Yeah, tonight you're sleeping with your rifle. Now, in the modern world, this sounds like either a political statement or a really questionable life choice. But out here in the wilderness of 1830, your rifle is life. It's food, protection, a tool for signalling, a walking stick if things go bad, and sometimes, believe it or not, a very strange but effective heat source. Here's how it works. After a long day of hiking, tracking, or just surviving, your rifle has absorbed heat from your hands and your body. It might not be warm exactly, but it holds a kind of ambient temperature that can delay freezing. In sub-zero weather, metal chills fast, and when your fingers are already halfway numb, even brushing against a frozen barrel can stick to your skin like a tongue on a winter pole. So what do the mountain men do? They sleep with it. Tucked under an arm, cradled across the chest, or even laid inside a blanket roll with them, their body heat keeps it just above freezing, and that might be enough to keep the mechanism from seizing up come morning. Black powder rifles aren't like modern weapons, they're moody, fickle. The flintlock or percussion cap needs to stay dry. The powder must remain loose and uncontaminated, and the barrel can't be frosted shut. If your rifle freezes and fails to fire, you might not eat the next day. Worse, you might not be able to defend yourself against a curious wolf or a too bold grizzly. Or worse still, a rival trapper with more hunger than manners. Sleeping with your rifle, then, becomes a kind of ritual. You roll it into your buffalo robe or fur blanket. You keep the lock tucked into your chest where your own body heat shields it. Some even placed a layer of tallow over the moving parts to create a moisture barrier. Others wrapped the barrel in oiled leather. Whatever it took to keep the weapon functional by dawn, they did it. Imagine spooning cold iron for survival. Romantic, right? Of course, you're not just curling up with your rifle for fun, you're also using it to protect everything else you have. Mountain men didn't travel heavy, and every tool was precious. A rifle was worth more than most horses. Lose it, and you're as good as naked. There were real dangers too. Raiders, hungry animals, sudden squalls that could blow a camp apart. Having the rifle close meant being able to react without scrambling around in the dark. Here's something curious, and a little eerie. Some trappers developed almost superstitious habits around their rifles, naming them, oiling them with reverence, even whispering to them like old friends. If you lived months alone in the wilderness, talking to your gear didn't seem so strange. One mountain man supposedly carved notches into his rifle stock not for kills, but for nights survived at sub-zero temperatures, little tallies of how many times the weapon kept him alive just by being there. And here's where the debate kicks in. Some historians argue that this whole sleep with your rifle thing is a bit overblown, that it's just romantic frontier myth, that, realistically, keeping a firearm that close in the night could be dangerous, especially when sleep-deprived and cold-stupid. There are even accounts of accidental discharges during night movement, someone waking in panic and grabbing the trigger instead of their blanket. Others counter that these men knew their weapons like extensions of their limbs and were careful to the point of obsession. Accidents? Sure, but rare, and the benefits far outweighed the risk. One fringe tale, half legend, half possible truth, involves a trapper named Baptiste who, in the middle of a brutal storm near the Bitterroots, dug himself a shallow snow trench, lined it with pine boughs, curled up under a bearskin, and slept with his rifle cradled tight under his chest. The next morning, after 6 hours buried under a drift, the only part of him not stiff or half frozen was the space around the gun. The warmth his body gave off, trapped in that little insulated cave, kept the lock dry and the barrel warm. The rifle fired on the first try that morning. He didn't say a word about it, just nodded once and started breaking camp. Like it was no big deal. Classic Baptiste. It's hard to appreciate just how cold it could get out there unless you've lived it. We're talking -20, -40 with wind. No ambient light. No buildings. No ambient noise except for distant owls. Maybe the crack of a tree splitting under the pressure of ice. It's not just uncomfortable, it's primal. Your breath freezes in your beard. Your eyelids feel stiff. Every exposed inch of skin becomes an argument with the elements. And that's the other reason for sleeping with your rifle. In that kind of environment, when your body is conserving every calorie, every bit of warmth, even something as simple as repositioning your gear in the middle of the night costs you. You don't want to search for your rifle under 3 feet of snow, or wake to find the lock frozen shut. Keeping it close, warm, and dry means one less crisis to solve before breakfast. Some mountain men even developed specific positions to sleep in, on their sides, knees tucked up, rifle snug along the torso, blanket wrapped tight over everything like a cocoon. If you got it just right, you could actually sleep decently, even in brutal weather. Get it wrong, and you'd wake up stiff, wet, and with a useless gun. So while modern advice might tell you to stow your gear outside your sleeping bag to prevent overheating or moisture, mountain men weren't playing by that rulebook. Their equation was simpler. What do I need to survive until morning? If the answer was a rifle, then yeah, it got the coveted spot in the bedroll. You might laugh now, but when the wind's howling like a banshee across a high pass and the fire's dying down, you'd be pretty thankful to have that cold iron tucked under your arm. Not because it's comfortable, but because it's something solid, something familiar, something ready. When everything else freezes, it's the only thing that reminds you you're still in the fight. So tonight, when you lock your doors and tuck in with your pillows and heated sheets, spare a moment for the man curled on a frostbitten slope, his body wrapped in dead fur and his rifle pressed close like a lover. He sleeps light, half aware, listening for the crack of a branch, the scuffle of claws, the silence that comes before a storm, and in that silence, it's not just the fire that keeps him alive. Let's talk food, because yes, you're cold, yes, you're tired, and yes, your boots feel like they're auditioning to become ice sculptures, but your stomach doesn't care. It's been growling since mid-morning, and now that the fire's lit and your rifle is resting like a warm iron puppy by your side, your body wants fuel, not just calories, fuel. Because out here in the deep freeze, digestion is survival. Here's what the mountain men knew about cold that most of us forgot the second we invented grocery stores and electric stoves. Cooking isn't just about making things taste better, it's a heating system. Every bite you put into your belly either helps you fight off the cold or works against you. Let's start with the basics. You're not roasting steaks over a roaring fire like some kind of wilderness Instagram chef. You're simmering, slow cooking, melting snow and rendering fat. Always fat. That's your best friend out here. Even more than protein. Fat burns slow and hot inside your body, keeping your furnace running long after the lean meat is gone. That's why pemmican, the old school, no frills, high-calorie survival bar, was such a staple. Imagine a block of dried meat mixed with berries and melted fat, pounded into a dense, greasy brick. It looks like something your dog might bury. But to a trapper spending 14 hours in a blizzard, it's a godsend. One chunk and you're warm for hours. Now let's talk water. You can't just chug snow. Go ahead and try. It'll suck the heat right out of you, lower your core temp and leave your mouth drier than an old boot heel. Mountain men knew to melt it first, slowly, patiently, over a small flame. Not a boiling boil. That wastes fuel. Just enough to warm it up and keep it liquid. They'd sometimes drop in a bit of fat or marrow to turn it into a thin broth. Hydration and calories, all in one steaming sip. Of course, you're not cooking on a camp stove. You've got a small tin pot, maybe a copper kettle if you're fancy, and a few basic tools. That's it. Most of your cooking is done with hot stones, ember beds, or hanging pots from a stick lashed between forked branches. No grill marks here. No searing. Just slow, smoky, survival-based cuisine that prioritizes staying alive over taste. But despite the limitations, mountain men got creative. One popular winter trick? Buried stews. You dig a shallow pit, fill it with hot stones, toss in your meat, rabbit, squirrel, trout, whatever's unlucky enough to cross your path. Wrap it in leaves or bark, bury it under coals and snow, and let it slow cook for hours while you go set traps. When you come back, dinner's waiting. Well, something like dinner anyway. It might be stringy, burnt on one side and half frozen on the other, but it's hot and it's yours. And here's the weird, slightly fringe fact you didn't expect. Some mountain men chewed on raw animal fat straight from their kills. Not for fun, not because they were feral cavemen, but because in extreme cold, raw fat offers a slow drip of energy without the digestive time of cooked meat. It's like wilderness keto, only with more frostbite and less avocado toast. Some even claimed it helped keep their lips from splitting. You chew, you swallow, and you keep walking. Bon appétit. There's a scholarly debate here, one that still hasn't quite been settled. Did mountain men truly understand the science of nutrition? Or were they just following instinct and desperation? Some historians argue that their reliance on fat-heavy diets shows a kind of intuitive understanding of metabolic needs, what we now call thermogenesis, the body's process of producing heat from food. Others say it was just practicality. Fat was easy to store, didn't spoil quickly in cold temps, and didn't require fancy preparation. Either way, it worked. These guys weren't freezing to death while gnawing dry jerky. And speaking of jerky, it was a staple, yes, but not always a great one in winter. Dry meat pulls moisture from your body as it's digested, and it's rough on a cold, underhydrated system. That's why the smart trappers would rehydrate their jerky in a pot of melted snow, turning it into a kind of stew or gruel. Add some roots if you're lucky. Maybe a pinch of salt if you traded wisely. Not gourmet, but it got the job done. Let's not forget about coffee, or, more accurately, whatever they had that vaguely resembled coffee. Roasted chicory, ground-up acorns, toasted grain. If it was dark and bitter and warm, it counted. Real coffee was gold, traded and rationed like treasure. In the dead of winter, a hot, bitter drink wasn't just comforting. It was motivating. Enough caffeine to wake you up, enough warmth to fight the shivers, even if it tasted like burnt mud and pine needle extract. Now every meal out here was a compromise. Eat too little, and you start to get sloppy, slow on your feet, careless with your fire, forgetful of simple tasks. That's how people die in cold country. But eat too much of the wrong thing. Lean meat with no fat, cold water, spoiled scraps, and your body can't keep up with the digestion. You start burning heat just to process it. Energy in, energy out. It's a math problem with a hard curve. And then there's the ritual of it all. After a long day, after the fire's built, your traps are checked, and your feet are thawing by the flames, you settle into your kitchen. It's nothing more than a flat rock, a soot-covered pot and a few sticks. But it's yours. You drop in your chunks of meat, maybe a sliver of tallow, a handful of dried tubers or berries. It smells earthy, smoky, slightly awful, but in a good way. You crouch close, shield the pot from the wind, and watch the steam rise like a signal to the sky. Still here, still kicking. And maybe you share. Maybe there's another trapper nearby, or a scout, or a curious fox eyeing you from the trees. You toss a scrap. The fox disappears. The other trapper nods once and drinks. No words needed. In cold country, food is more than fuel. It's a bond, a pause, a reminder that you're still human, even out here where everything wants to turn you into a popsicle. So tonight, as your microwave hums and your soup bubbles politely on a stove, imagine cooking in a snow pit with a stick, a rock, and the last 2 ounces of bear grease you've been hoarding for weeks. Imagine eating it slowly, with cracked lips and blistered hands, knowing every bite is buying you a little more time against the dark. Because the mountain men, they didn't eat to enjoy the food. They ate to stay warm enough to see the next sunrise. You wake up to silence. Not the comforting kind. The kind that feels too still, too brittle. Even the fire, which you'd carefully banked under ash before sleep, has gone cold. The sky's still dark, but there's a faint silver glow. Not from sun, but from snow reflecting starlight. The air is colder than it was last night. You know this because your breath curls like smoke, but then hangs there in a frozen ribbon before vanishing. Your beard, if you have one, crackles when you move. Everything is stiff, everything is brittle, and you have a river to cross. Now, crossing icy water might not sound like a survival puzzle, but it's one of the riskiest moves a mountain man could make in winter. And yet, they did it all the time. Because when you're following beaver runs, moving between trap lines, or just trying to get to the next stretch of woods that might have food and shelter, rivers don't stop for you. They don't care how cold it is. They flow, they freeze, they thaw unpredictably. And if you screw it up, if you fall in, misjudge the ice, or soak your gear, you're on a clock that's ticking faster than your heart rate. So how did they do it? How did mountain men face icy water like it was just another Tuesday? First, they observed, patience wasn't optional. You didn't just stomp onto a frozen creek like a fool. You watched. You listened. You studied how the ice looked. Dull and snow-covered meant it might be thicker but also older, possibly rotten from underneath. Clear glassy patches might be new and fragile. You looked for animal tracks, deer, elk, even coyote. If a heavy creature made it across, that's a decent sign. Not a guarantee, but decent. And you tapped with your rifle butt or a pole before every step. Mountain men walked like they were testing the earth with every footfall. Because they were. But sometimes there wasn't even ice, just open water. A slow-moving stream, barely a few feet wide, but cold enough to kill if it touched your skin. That's when the real tricks came in. You'd first strip down, yes, strip in the snow, down to bare skin or just your underlayer. Why? Because it's better to have you get wet than your clothes. Wet buckskin or wool turns into armor made of ice. It freezes fast and weighs you down. Naked, you're faster, drier, and you can put your dry gear back on after crossing, assuming you make it. This is one of those moments where you ask yourself, what kind of person voluntarily walks through freezing water in the dead of winter just to check a beaver trap? The answer, someone with no other choice. Someone whose survival depends on one more pelt, one more meal, or maybe someone who just doesn't know how to live any other way. They'd pick the narrowest, slowest part of the stream, use a pole for balance, step in slowly. It's not about heroics, it's about control. The shock of the cold hits like a slap to the soul. Your skin screams, your muscles lock. You grit your teeth and keep going. Every second matters, every step is calculated. The moment you're across, you move. Fast. You towel off with whatever you have, shirt, blanket, bare hands, then layer back up. Dry socks, dry mittens. Rebuild warmth immediately. No fire nearby. Tough. Jump, swing your arms. Do whatever it takes to generate heat. Because once you start to chill, the cold moves fast, and it doesn't give you a second chance. Now in more favourable conditions, there were workarounds. A makeshift bridge of downed logs. A few snow-covered stones if you trusted your balance. Sometimes they'd use snowshoes to distribute weight and slide across thin ice without breaking through. Other times they'd cut fresh poles and lay them flat to walk on, a technique borrowed from native guides who understood rivers better than any map ever could. And speaking of native techniques, many of the smartest crossing tricks came directly from the indigenous peoples of the Rockies. They taught trappers how to read the ice by sound. Tap it, and if it echoes sharp and high, it's thin. If it thuds low and flat, it might be safe. They taught them how to waterproof moccasins using pine resin and rawhide, and they showed them how to build quick snow platforms, flat packs of snow that could distribute weight when crossing slushy areas. Some of those methods still work today, though few ever learn them. Now for a fringe fact that feels like cheating but absolutely worked. Some trappers carried bear grease or tallow and rubbed it on their skin before crossing water, like homemade insulation, greaser's armour. It sounds ridiculous, until you realise seals, whales and other cold water mammals evolved that exact trick over millennia. The fat traps heat, repels water, and buys you a few extra minutes before hypothermia kicks in. You'll smell like a rendering shed afterward, but you'll be alive. Still, not every crossing went well. There are plenty of recorded cases of trappers falling through the ice, panicking, soaking their gear, and dying just a few feet from shore. One man, nobody remembers his name, fell into the Snake River during a thaw, managed to crawl out but couldn't light a fire with wet hands and wet powder. They found him the next day, frozen to a tree stump, his flint still clutched in his fist. It's grim, but it's real. And it's why mountain men never ever took water lightly. Some of them developed near-ritualistic habits to deal with it, crossing the same spots every year, marking safe paths with carved notches in nearby trees, travelling with a partner during thaw season, even if they preferred solitude. Cold water wasn't a villain, it was just a fact of life, and they treated it with the same wary respect they gave to fire and wolves. There's a debate among historians about how often these crossings actually happened in winter. Some suggest they were rare, avoided at all costs unless absolutely necessary. Others argue that winter travel, especially in the later fur trade years, required frequent crossings, especially in beaver-rich valleys crisscrossed with creeks. It's hard to say for sure. Journals don't always mention the daily drudgery, just the dramatic parts. And for a mountain man, crossing an icy river wasn't drama. It was just Tuesday. So here you are, breath steaming in the still morning, your fire cold, your boots laced, staring at a ribbon of water cutting through the snow like a dark vein. You know it's shallow, you know it's slow, you also know it's going to suck, and you go anyway. Because that's the thing about cold country. Nobody gets across dry. You just learn how to dry out faster than the cold can take you. Your boots are finally dry. Well, dry enough to not squish. You've made it across that bone-chilling creek without falling through, which honestly puts you ahead of the game. Now your focus shifts to your feet, and not just because they're complaining. In cold country, footwork is survival, and footwear, that's strategy. And here's where things get interesting, because instead of heavy-duty snow boots with insulated soles and waterproof liners, mountain men often chose something that to modern sensibilities seems completely absurd. Soft, thin moccasins. Yes, moccasins. Those little leather slippers that seem better suited for a museum or a cosy evening by a fireplace than trudging through snowdrifts. But to the seasoned trapper, they weren't just acceptable. They were preferred. And once you understand why, it starts to make a weird kind of sense. Boots, the kind European settlers brought west, were sturdy. Thick leather, tall shafts, heavy soles. But in sub-zero temperatures, all that leather had a nasty habit of turning into something closely resembling concrete. If you'd walk through snow or a shallow creek and hadn't dried your boots properly, which, spoiler alert, happened all the time, by morning they'd be frozen stiff. You'd have to sit by the fire with them jammed under your armpits just to make them wearable again. And even then, the stiffness could crack seams or rub your ankles raw. Moccasins, by contrast, were flexible. Made from soft-tanned hide, elk, deer, moose, they bent with your foot instead of fighting it. They didn't freeze into rigid foot prisons overnight, and better still, they could be easily dried by the fire, sometimes even worn while drying, since the leather was thin and porous, quick to make, quick to replace, and incredibly quiet. Ideal for hunting. For all their drawbacks, they were remarkably well adapted to life in the wilderness. But, and this is important, moccasins alone weren't enough. Not for winter. That's where the layering came in again. You'd wear thick wool socks if you were lucky enough to have them, or multiple layers of hide. Some trappers even stuffed their moccasins with dry grass or animal hair for added insulation. Others wrapped them in strips of fur, creating impromptu mucklucks that kept heat in and snow out. It looked ridiculous. Probably smelled worse, but worked beautifully. Still, there was one big problem. Moccasins soaked through easily. Step in slush, and your feet were instantly wet, which meant you had to manage them constantly. Mountain men would change socks often, dry their moccasins by the fire each night, and sometimes carry multiple pairs just to rotate. Keeping feet dry was a full-time job. You weren't just walking, you were foot-minding, every hour checking for numb spots, every break inspecting toes. In the cold, you don't wait for frostbite to announce itself, you stay ahead of it. There's an old wilderness saying, take care of your feet or you'll leave them behind. Trappers live by that. No feet, no walking. No walking, no trapping. No trapping, no food. And the snow doesn't care about your excuses. And here's a quirky, kind of ingenious trick. Some mountain men greased their feet with tallow or bear fat before slipping into socks and moccasins. It created a waterproof barrier, not a perfect one, but enough to repel some moisture and wind. It also kept skin from drying and cracking. In a world without lotion or moleskin or heated foot baths, fat was the answer to everything. You could eat it, burn it, cook with it, and smear it on your body like some kind of icy wilderness spa treatment. Versatile, if not exactly glamorous. And yes, there were still times when boots made sense. Crossing rocky ground, fighting through brambles, or riding for long distances. Some trappers carried boots in their packs and switched them out when conditions required. But for daily life in the snow-covered woods, moccasins won the long game. They were lighter, quieter, and easier to replace. If one tore, you could stitch it with sinew in a half hour. If a boot split, you were in trouble. It sparks an interesting debate among modern historians and outdoor experts. Should we be rethinking our dependence on ultra-technical winter footwear? Some say yes, pointing to indigenous and frontier moccasin systems as models of adaptability and low-tech genius. Others argue that modern materials like synthetic insulation and waterproof membranes have simply outpaced leather and wool in performance. But maybe it's not about which is better. Maybe it's about which makes you pay attention. Because moccasins force mindfulness. You don't just stomp around, you tread carefully, you listen to your body, you feel the ground, the cold, the shift of snow beneath you. Every step is a conversation between you and the landscape. You can't tune out. That kind of awareness is rare now. But the mountain men had it in spades. There's a fringe tale passed around in trapping circles about a man who walked nearly 50 miles through a blizzard, wearing nothing but moccasins wrapped in rabbit fur. He survived, not because he was some kind of wilderness Superman, but because he kept moving, changed his foot wrappings constantly, and used the heat of fire pits buried in snow to warm his feet at rest stops. He arrived frostbitten, but alive. A few toes gone, but alive. And that, in cold country, counts as a win. And what about traction, you ask? You'd think soft leather on snow would be a recipe for slips and falls. But here's the surprise. Moccasins actually grip snow pretty well, especially fresh powder or hardpack. Their wide flat soles don't dig in, they float. Add snowshoes and they shine. No laces to freeze, no soles to crack, just wrap, tie and go. You wouldn't wear them to shovel your driveway, but to a mountain man walking 5 to 10 miles a day across varied terrain. They made sense. They were fast. They were quiet. They kept you in tune with your surroundings. So tonight, before you slide your socks into your fleece-lined slippers and wiggle your toes by the heater, picture yourself crouched by a fire, steam rising off a pair of leather moccasins hung on a stick, your feet wrapped in dry grass and wool, fat smeared between your toes and snow crunching just beyond the firelight. You're cold, you're tired, but your feet are taken care of. And in this world, that means you're already halfway to survival. You might think you've got winter figured out. Your feet are dry, your fire's going, your belly's full of beaver stew that probably had more fur than meat, but you're surviving. Then you notice your beard. Or rather, you feel it. Heavy, cold, icy. It crunches when you move your jaw, and your mustache. It's now a frozen handlebar that's beginning to cement your top lip to your face. Welcome to the uniquely miserable and wildly underestimated issue of facial hair in extreme cold. Mountain men didn't have razors on hand, not unless they carried them for trading or cleaning game, and even then, shaving in the cold was one of those luxuries that got laughed out of camp. So the beard stayed. In fact, it was often seen as protective. Insulation for your face, right? A natural scarf, that's the theory. And in mild cold, sure, it works. But once the temp drop past a certain point, and add in the moisture from your breath, that beard becomes an ice magnet. You exhale, and warm moist air escapes from your mouth. It hits the freezing air, turns instantly to frost, and clings to whatever's nearby. Guess what's nearby? Hair, your beard, your lashes, the fuzz in your ears. Everything freezes, and it doesn't just look like a bad calendar photo from the Yukon. It becomes a problem. Ice builds up, it hardens, it pulls, it cracks the skin underneath. Eventually it weighs enough to stiffen your jaw and make talking uncomfortable. Sometimes even painful. Mountain men learn to manage it with a quiet sort of desperation. The first tactic? Don't touch it. Ever tried to chip ice out of your beard with a mitten? Congratulations, you've now ripped half your face off. The skin under the hair is more sensitive than you think, especially when it's cold and dry. Pulling at the ice only makes it worse. Mountain men would sit by the fire, chin tilted up, and just wait. Let the heat melt it slowly, even if it took hours. You watch the drops fall from your moustache like tiny frozen teardrops. 1, 2, 30. Eventually your face remembers it's made of skin, not pine bark. And there's a fringe solution that sounds fake but is backed up by frontier law. Rubbing bear fat into the beard. Just a little. Just enough to coat the hairs, make them slick, hydrophobic. It helped stop water from clinging and forming icicles in the first place. Of course, now you smell like a bear, which has its own set of issues if you're trying not to attract one. But in a world where you're not worried about social norms, having a greasy face might be preferable to a frozen one. There's another cold weather hack borrowed from the tribes who knew this land far better. Wrapping. A simple scarf made of rabbit skin or even strips of woven grass tied over the lower face. It trapped breath, kept the moisture from reaching the beard, and gave your nose a fighting chance at staying attached. Some mountain men adapted this into the face flap, a triangular cloth tied like a bandit mask, worn tight during travel, removed by the fire. Not for fashion, for function. If it froze, you didn't try to peel it off. You let it thaw, or you risked pulling off the top layer of your lip with it. And the nose, that little bridge of skin we never think about, is a whole separate tragedy. Out here, it's one of the first things to go numb, then burn, then freeze. You won't feel it at first. Just a little chill, maybe some stinging. Then, hours later, someone tells you it's white, or black, and not in the healthy kind of way. Frostbite doesn't ask for permission. Mountain men learn to check each other. Quick glances, a finger to the cheek, the ear, the nose tip. If it was too cold, too stiff, they'd slap it. Hard. Not out of cruelty, but because pain meant circulation. No pain. You were in trouble. Some men tied bits of fur around their ears or wore ear flaps that could be let down as needed. You didn't always look cool, but again, nobody was trying to win style points in a Wyoming whiteout. There's a curious scholarly debate around whether facial hair was truly protective in the cold, or just a cultural default. Some claim a thick beard traps heat, insulates blood vessels, and shields the skin from windburn. Others argue it holds moisture and makes everything worse. Even today, Arctic explorers split on this. Some swear by the beard, others go full shave to avoid the ice build-up. The mountain men didn't really have a choice, but they adapted. They learned to carry dry cloths to pat down the ice. They turned their beards into weather gauges. Frosted stiff. It's time to stop and warm up. Flexible and damp. You're still good for a few miles. And then there's the fringe group, the ones who did shave. A few old journals mention men who kept their faces bare even in winter. They were often loners, slightly unhinged, or former soldiers used to discipline. These guys kept a razor tucked in their possibles bag and did dry shaves with a little snow as rinse. Brutal, absolutely brutal. But they swore by it. Less weight on the face, less to freeze, easier to keep clean. You could always spot them by the red, chapped cheeks and the look of someone who'd forgotten what comfort felt like. But beard or no beard, everyone faced the same foe: condensation. Your breath was the enemy. It snuck into everything. Blankets, scarves, hoods. Sleep too long with your face buried in your bedroll, and you'd wake up to a crust of ice on the inside. That's why mountain men built breath holes in their sleeping systems, tiny air vents to direct exhaled air away from fabrics and fur. But more on that later. For now, your jaw aches. Your moustache has thawed just enough to feel like it's hanging in wet strings. You press your face close to the fire, hands braced on your knees, eyes half shut against the sparks. There's no sound except for the faint sizzle as droplets fall from your beard into the embers. You made it through another night. You didn't shave, You didn't scream when your face peeled a little, and tomorrow you'll grease your beard with just a touch of fat, wrap your face like an outlaw, and walk out into the frost like it's just another Monday. Because out here, where breath turns to daggers and your own face tries to betray you, mountain men didn't win by being tough. They won by being clever. Cold is patient. But so were they. You're sitting by the fire, hands outstretched, trying to soak in every lick of heat you can. It's not doing much, just a low burn of coals and a few crackling twigs, but it's enough to keep your fingers moving, which is important because now you need to do something gross, something greasy, something that smells faintly like bacon left out too long. You need to reach into your pouch, dig out the lumpy yellowish chunk inside, and smear tallow on just about everything you own, including, unfortunately, your face. Welcome to the greasy underworld of mountain man survival, the age of tallow and grease everything. It wasn't just a trick, it was a lifestyle, and it's something we've mostly forgotten in our antiseptic, citrus-scented world. But back then, animal fat was the duct tape of the wild. You could cook with it, preserve with it, lubricate gear, waterproof leather, soothe skin, and keep your weapons functional. If you didn't smell vaguely like an old frying pan by week's end, were you even really living? Tallow is just rendered fat, usually from bison, elk, deer, or bear. You cut the fat into small pieces, cook it low and slow over a fire until it melts down, strain it through cloth, and pour it into a pouch or tin. When it cools, it solidifies into something between wax and butter. Not tasty, but deeply functional. And in cold weather, it was the secret ingredient to staying alive. Let's start with the skin. Cold air pulls moisture out of you like a thief in the night. Your lips crack, your knuckles split, your cheeks go raw. Mountain men didn't have lotion. They had grease. Every morning before heading out, they'd rub a thin layer of tallow across exposed skin, cheeks, nose, forehead, even eyelids. It acted like a barrier, keeping wind and frostbite at bay. It didn't heal damage so much as delay it. You'd still get chapped, still peel, but slower, more survivably. And yes, it clogged pores and made you look like you'd lost a fight with a stick of butter, but nobody cared. Out here, vanity had frozen and died weeks ago. They greased their hands too, especially around the nails and between the fingers. Then came the feet. Before socks went on, grease, sometimes inside the moccasins too. Tallow helped reduce friction, kept leather supple, and served as a poor man's antifungal, which was important when you were walking 10 miles a day in wet hides that hadn't been properly dried in a week. Then came the gear. Leather needed to be treated constantly or it would crack in the cold and become useless. Rifle slings, powder bags, leggings, belts, all of it got a regular rub down with fat. It kept the material pliable and more water resistant. A stiff frozen strap could snap under tension, and that kind of gear failure wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Imagine your pack tearing loose mid-scramble on an icy slope, tumbling away with your food and flint inside. That's a death sentence over something as simple as neglected leather. Tallow had a special relationship with weapons. Flintlocks and percussion caps were incredibly sensitive to moisture, especially the delicate metal parts of the lock and trigger. Mountain men used grease to seal those parts, rubbing it into the grooves and joints, creating a sort of natural weatherproofing. Too much, and you'd gum up the works. Too little, and snowmelt would sneak in, corrode the metal, and make your gun a paperweight when you needed it most. They knew the balance. It wasn't a science, it was a feel. Just enough to make the parts shine under moonlight, not enough to drip. And that wasn't even the half of it. Tallow could be melted into a crude lamp by adding a wick, rubbed onto your knife blade to prevent rust, mixed with ash to create a makeshift soap. Terrible smelling, but functional. Some even mixed tallow with wild herbs and pine resin to create medicinal balms for cracked skin, or to help close wounds when no other options were available. Here's a weird fringe use: bug repellent. Believe it or not, some mountain men added crushed garlic, pine pitch or wild onion to their tallow and smeared it on their skin during warmer seasons to keep mosquitoes and biting flies at bay. The scent? Absolutely horrifying, but reportedly effective. In the cold months, it wasn't about bugs, it was about sealing warmth in and locking cold out. But grease came with a risk. It made you smell. In a place where everything's hungry and has a better nose than you, that's not ideal. Bears, wolves, mountain lions, They could all pick up the scent of animal fat from miles away. Some trappers learned to mask the smell by rolling in ashes or dry dirt after greasing up. Others simply accepted it. The cold had its own scent, and so did survival. If a bear showed up, well, that's why you slept with your rifle. There's an open question among historians about just how much grease these men actually used. Some journals describe daily rituals of rubbing and smearing, while others barely mention it at all. Were those trappers tougher? Or just the kind of men who didn't think a layer of frozen skin mattered much? No one's sure. But the consensus is clear. Grease was common, if not universal, especially for those who lasted more than one brutal winter. You might wonder what it felt like, walking around with fat coating your skin and scenting your clothes. The answer, it felt like protection, like insulation. It was slippery and unpleasant and sometimes itchy, but it worked. A thin barrier between you and the worst the cold could throw at you. So now imagine this. You're sitting by the fire and you pull off your mittens. Your hands are red and cracked, the skin around your knuckles raw. You scoop a little tallow with 2 fingers, just enough to fill the cracks, and smear it on. It burns a little, then soothes, then disappears into a glossy sheen. You do the same with your face, your boots, the lock of your rifle. You work it in, careful, methodical, not because it's comfortable, but because it has to be done. Tomorrow's going to be colder. The wind's shifting. You can feel it in the way the smoke moves, low and restless. But tonight, you're greased, warmish, and ready. Ready in that specific, quiet, half-miserable way mountain men learn to live in. Because out here, the difference between frostbite and a fighting chance might just be one handful of old yellow bear fat. There's something ironic about snow, how it can freeze you to the bone and yet, at the same time, be the very thing that keeps you warm. That's one of the forgotten lessons mountain men understood better than most. Snow, when used right, isn't the enemy. It's insulation, it's structure, it's even comfort, if you can stretch the definition of comfort to include sleeping in a frozen burrow with frost hanging from your eyebrows. But hey, welcome to the frontier. You wouldn't think snow has warmth in it. It's cold, obviously. Cold enough to bite your fingers off if you scoop it barehanded. But when it's packed, shaped, and layered with some backwards creativity, it becomes a buffer, a barrier between you and the killing air. And mountain men used that to their advantage, especially when there wasn't a cave, a cabin, or even a good windbreak in sight. Let's say you're caught in the open. The light's fading, your traps are checked, and it's too far to reach the next camp. You look around. Trees? Yes. Wind? Plenty. Shelter? Not unless you make it. That's when you do what the old-timers did, dig into the snow. They called it a snow pit or snow nest, and it was simple in theory, brutal in practice. You find a drift, deep, packed, ideally sheltered from direct wind. You dig in, not straight down but angled like a fox den, big enough to fit your body, maybe a little wider if you're feeling fancy. The trick is not to dig too deep, just far enough to shield yourself from wind and blowing powder. Then, if you're really thinking ahead, you lay pine boughs on the floor. Snow's a great insulator, sure, but it will still suck the warmth from anything it touches. Pine boughs, or even your extra clothes, form a barrier to keep your body heat in. Now here comes the genius part, the roof. You either lay branches across the top and pack snow over them, or if you're solo and desperate, you leave the top open and create a windbreak with your pack and snow walls. The key is to make the inside small, just big enough for you and your gear. A tight space means your body heat actually does something. In a cavernous tent or under a tree, that heat just vanishes into the night. It's not cozy. It's not romantic. You're wedged into a snow cocoon, layered in fur and buckskin, your breath curling against the wall and turning to frost within seconds. But you're out of the wind, and that alone can make the difference between shivering all night and losing toes by morning. Some trappers took it further. They built what amounted to mini igloos, block by block, using snow that was just wet enough to cut but dry enough to stack. Most didn't go that far unless they were stuck in one place for a while or had time to kill between snowstorms. But when they did, they'd build with cunning. Small entrance, dome-shaped inside, even vent holes for breath. Snow shelters breathe. Did you know that? The right snowpack has enough tiny air pockets that, if you build carefully, your shelter won't suffocate you. Too sealed and carbon dioxide builds up fast, which is why they always left a gap. Just a few inches, enough for the air to flow and the breath not to freeze you from the inside out. Now here's a fringe twist. Some trappers line the inner walls of their shelters with animal hides, shiny side in. Not only did it keep the snow from melting onto their blankets, but it also reflected back a bit of body heat. Not a ton, but in survival mode every calorie of warmth counts, and that's really the core of what they knew. The cold didn't kill you all at once, it nibbled at you. One missed meal, one wet sock, one gust of wind. It was death by 1,000 shivers. So everything they did, snow pits, roof linings, air vents, was about slowing that process down. There's still debate among outdoor survival experts today about how viable snow shelters really are in prolonged cold. Some say they're great in emergencies but too labour-intensive for regular use. Others insist that once you get the technique down, you can sleep warmer in a snow burrow than in a tent, especially when it's 20 below and the wind is howling through the pines like a pack of ghost coyotes. Modern gear adds a layer of comfort, sure, but the fundamentals haven't changed. Insulation, wind protection, and smart venting are still the holy trinity of winter sleep. And speaking of insulation, snow had other uses too. Ever heard of a cold trap? That's when you build your camp slightly above a low drift, using the fact that cold air sinks. Mountain men didn't always sleep on snow. Sometimes they slept above it, using natural terrain to stay a few degrees warmer. That's right. Positioning your camp on the side of a slope instead of the bottom could mean the difference between waking up crusted in ice or just a little chilled. Cold air is lazy. It flows down and pools. So smart men camped high and tight. Snow was also used to preserve food. In a pinch, they'd dig a hole, drop in fresh meat and cover it up. Instant freezer. Good for days, maybe even weeks. But only if animals didn't find it. So you buried it deep, and sometimes, not always, you urinated around the perimeter. Harsh, but effective. The scent kept most scavengers away. Not dignified, but again, nobody out here's winning beauty contests. You'd think all this snow exposure would leave a man damp and miserable, but here's the kicker. It was often drier inside a snow shelter than out in the open. Wind dries you out. Blowing snow gets into everything. Inside a snow burrow, things are weirdly still, quiet, even peaceful, if you can ignore the mild claustrophobia and the constant awareness that you're sleeping inside a frozen grave-shaped tunnel. And yeah, sometimes shelters collapsed. If you built too fast or used bad snow, it could cave in. But most mountain men knew how to build with the land. They watched how the snow sat on trees, felt the texture underfoot. Powdery snow? Useless. Wind-packed and firm? Perfect. They carried small wooden tools for cutting blocks, or just used their belt knives and brute force. So tonight, as you fluff your pillows and tuck your toes under that weighted blanket, imagine crawling into a hole in the side of a snowbank, laying your head on a rolled-up coat that smells like tallow and wood smoke, and closing your eyes in a silence so deep it swallows your breath. Outside, the wind screams over the drifts, but inside your little snow cave, you're just warm enough to make it till morning. Because when the cold tries to kill you, sometimes the only thing that saves you is more cold, shaped with your own two hands. You're moving through the forest now, snowshoes strapped tight, each step a soft crunch on the crusted surface. The skies turn that overcast grey that eats up sound and colour, leaving the world strangely muted. The only noise is your own breathing, thick and steady, and the faint rasp of snow brushing your leggings. It's cold, colder than it's been in days. But something's off. You stop, you sniff the air, and something in your brain, way down in that old animal part, says, wait. Mountain men didn't always rely on sight to sense danger. In the white wilderness, where everything blends together, trees, snow, sky, smoke, your eyes can lie. But your nose, that's a whole other story. You're not sniffing for perfume or pipe smoke. You're sniffing for change, for the sudden whiff of burnt wood where it shouldn't be, the tang of wet fur, the sour musk of a predator nearby. Or, if you're really tuned in, the odd metallic bite of approaching weather. Snow on the wind has a smell, believe it or not. A kind of dry electricity that creeps in before a storm. This wasn't just a wilderness parlour trick. It was survival. Mountain men learned early that their nose was a warning system, primitive, but effective. Most people today have dulled theirs with filters and artificial scents. But out here, you live close to the land, and your brain starts reassigning importance. The smell of pine sap tells you the wind's shifted. The acrid bite of distant fire means you're not alone. And the worst, that sweet coppery tang of rot. Something dead nearby. Could be an animal, could be something else. One of the more surprising things mountain men understood was that scent travelled differently in cold air. Warm air lifts it, disperses it in messy swirls. Cold air presses it down, holds it low to the ground, and carries it in long, slow drifts. That's why wolves can smell a kill from miles off. It's also why you could be smelled before you even see a campsite. Which worked both ways. If you were downwind from a rival trapper or a group of people you'd rather not meet, you might catch their scent before you caught sight of them. Grease, smoke, horse sweat, wet leather. All of it leaves a trail. There's a fringe bit of lore passed around in journals and campfire stories about a trapper named Silas, who claimed he could smell beaver musk from 2 ridges away. Said it hit him like pipe smoke in a church. People laughed, of course, but the thing is, beaver castoreum, which they use to mark territory, has a potent, spicy, sweet smell. Not exactly pleasant, not exactly foul, just distinct. Silas might have been full of it, but there's more than one record of trappers catching scent on the wind and altering course because of it. When you're that attuned to your surroundings, your nose becomes a compass. And it didn't stop at wildlife. Trappers could tell if an area had recently hosted someone else, just from the faint scent of ash, cooking grease, or human sweat. Even after the fire was cold, even after the prints were buried in fresh snow, the air remembered. And if it smelled wrong, you kept moving. Maybe it was a rival trapper. Maybe it was a raiding party. Maybe it was something worse. The cold doesn't kill with a roar, it kills with a whisper, and your nose is one of the few things that hears it. Of course, it wasn't always reliable. A shifting wind could trick you. A blocked sinus could blind you. There are accounts of trappers who ignored their instincts, pressed on even when they noticed the scent of burnt sap or a musk they couldn't place, and walked straight into ambushes or dens or worse. But most learned to trust the twitch in their nose, that gut-level unease that said something was off, even if you couldn't say why. There's a scholarly debate here, believe it or not. Some researchers think this so-called scent intuition was more about learned pattern recognition than actual olfactory sensitivity. That is, mountain men weren't smelling more. They were just better at interpreting smells. They'd learned over years what certain combinations meant. A bit of wood smoke and wet fur meant someone was drying hides nearby. The scent of grease and burnt meat might mean an abandoned camp. Others argue that living without industrial pollution and artificial smells did sharpen the senses in a very real way. That the modern nose is just dulled by the noise of modern life. It's a debate that, like many things in frontier history, probably lands somewhere in the middle. And here's something unexpected. Trappers use smell proactively. When laying traps, they'd mask their scent with pine pitch or smoke. Some rubbed dirt on their hands, or even animal dung to blend in with the surroundings. Others used bait soaked in castoreum or rancid grease to attract predators. It was a whole language of scent, coded, precise, and powerful. You might not see the animal, but if you could trick its nose, you could own its path. There's even evidence that some trappers use their nose to track weather. It sounds ridiculous, like some backwoods weatherman sniffing the breeze. But talk to any old-timer today who works the land, and they'll tell you the same. You can smell snow coming. Not snow on the ground, snow in the air. It's a dry, powdery scent. Ozone, they say, or metal. And before a thaw, the smell of wet bark, of distant rot reawakening under ice. It's subtle, fleeting, but real. So now picture yourself kneeling in a snowbank, the wind nudging your hood, eyes narrowed at the horizon. You sniff the air. Just a faint trace of something. Burnt pine. Someone else has made camp nearby. Maybe a day old, maybe closer. You shift your pack, tighten your mittens, and change course. You don't need to see them. You just know. That's the part of the cold we've forgotten. The listening, the noticing, the way survival once depended on your ability to catch the faintest warning sign in the breeze. Your phone won't tell you when the wind smells wrong. Your thermostat won't warn you about the wolf scent on the trail ahead. But your nose might, if you let it. So there you are, wrapped in a mountain of fur and buckskin, curled tight in your snow burrow, with the fire long gone and only your own body heat to keep you company. The stars are out, what few you can see through the trees, and the cold is like a living thing pressing in from every side. Your breath escapes in little clouds, then clings to the ceiling of your shelter, turning the inside of your blanket into a frosted cave. And just when you start to drift off, your own breath wakes you up. because it's getting hard to breathe. The air feels thick, stale, even dangerous. That's when the smarter mountain men would sit up, blink into the dark and check what they called the breath hole. Now this wasn't some quaint mountain expression, it was literal. When a man wrapped himself in heavy blankets, hides, or bedrolls, especially in the snow or in a tightly sealed lean-to, he had to make sure air could get in and out. If not, his own breath would betray him. Warm moisture vapour seeps out, condenses on the inside of the fabric or the roof of your snow shelter, and slowly fills the space with humidity and carbon dioxide. Too much of that. You stop sleeping and start suffocating. Silently. In your sleep. How's that for a bedtime thought? Mountain men figured this out early. You could freeze. You could starve. You could fall to wolves or an accidental bullet. But death by breathing wrong? That one hits differently. It's slow and sneaky. The kind of danger you don't notice until your vision goes weird and your heart starts thudding like a war drum. The fix? Simple. They cut holes, tiny ones, in the roof of a snow pit or at the edge of their blanket near their mouth, just enough to keep fresh air moving. Even if it meant a cold draft on the face, that was better than curling up in a warm, slowly asphyxiating bubble. Some used a hollow reed or the barrel of an old quill to poke out a tunnel of airflow. Others just left a loose flap. The trick was airflow without losing all your heat, because that's the balancing act out here. Warmth versus breathability. You lose too much warmth and you're a shivering mess. But seal yourself in too tight and your own lungs work against you. Now, this brings up an odd little bit of gear that some mountain men prized more than gold. The sleep hood. Sometimes it was just a scrap of wool with eye holes. Sometimes it was a full head wrap made from rabbit skin or beaver pelt. But the idea was the same. You wrapped your head and left just enough space near your mouth and nose to breathe out without trapping it all inside your bedroll. Think of it like a wearable chimney. Let the steam out. Keep the warmth in. There's an actual survival science behind all of this. When you exhale, your breath contains moisture and heat. If it can't escape, it saturates the air around you. That moisture then condenses on the inner layers of your bedding. And once the insulation is damp, it stops working. You might not notice at first, but after a few nights of doing this, sealing up tight to stay warm, your blanket or fur robe becomes heavier, wetter, and colder. It's like sleeping inside a sponge. And in below zero temperatures, a damp bed means death. One fringe solution trappers developed was rotating bedding, drying out one layer by the fire while using another. Of course, not everyone had the luxury of extra blankets, but those who did rotated their hides like clockwork. Wet on the outside, turn it. Wet on the inside, hang it near the coals. It wasn't just comfort, it was habit, ritual. And for some, it was the difference between shivering through dawn or waking up frozen to your own bedroll. There's debate among cold weather survival experts today about whether it's better to sleep with your head inside or outside the blanket. Modern thinking leans toward keeping your face exposed, even if it's cold, to prevent condensation. But the mountain men lived the results firsthand. They didn't have down sleeping bags or Gore-Tex bivvies. They had fur, wool, leather. And if those got soaked from the inside out, you were basically turning your bed into a coffin. There's a half-forgotten story about a trapper, no one remembers his name, just the legend, who curled up in a makeshift shelter during a snowstorm, wrapped himself tight in a buffalo robe, and woke up paralysed with cold and barely breathing. His own breath had iced the inside of his bedding. The robe, heavy with frost, trapped the moisture instead of letting it escape. By the time he clawed his way out, he had frostbite on his cheeks and a beard frozen into one solid piece. They say he never wrapped that tight again, left a hand-sized hole at his chest for the air to move, even if it meant a cold draft. And that's where the wisdom came in, the balance. Mountain men weren't just brute survivors, they were technicians. Cold wasn't conquered by toughness alone. It was studied, like a predator, watched, learned, defeated one careful habit at a time, and one of the quietest, most critical habits was learning how to sleep in cold country without being smothered by your own instincts. Even the shape of their shelters reflected this understanding. A lean-to built with a slanted roof allowed rising air and breath vapour to escape naturally. A snow cave had a lower entrance and a small breathing vent near the top. Some even burned a small coal nearby, not for warmth, but to act as a moisture test. If it flickered erratically or snuffed out, you knew the air was getting bad. Primitive CO2 monitor? Maybe, clever, definitely. So tonight, when you pull your covers up and tuck in tight, remember, the mountain men would never bury their faces like that. They'd leave a gap, a slit, a breath hole, something to let the air in and the vapour out. Because while warmth is essential, so is remembering how much trouble your own breath can cause in the wrong conditions. You sleep better when you know how to breathe. And out here, where the wind bites and the snow creeps in through every seam, the difference between waking up sore and waking up stiff as a log might just be that little hole near your face. It starts with sweat. Not a lot, just a slow trickle down your back as you hoist your pack over one shoulder. You've been climbing uphill for half an hour, maybe more, weaving through thick timber with the snow rising past your calves. It's cold, sure, your beard is crusted, and your breath fogs heavy. But under all those layers, under your buckskin shirt and wool underthings, you're overheating. You stop, tug at your collar, and feel the wet fabric sticking to your chest. Just a little sweat. No big deal, right? Wrong. Out here, sweat is the devil's handshake. Mountain men learned early, either by listening to seasoned trappers or through a hard, near-dead experience, that sweating in freezing temperatures is a fast track to disaster. And it's one of those lessons modern folk still get wrong all the time, because sweating feels good at first. It feels like proof that you're warm, you're working, alive. But in cold country, sweat doesn't just evaporate, it freezes. It sinks into your clothes, chills you from the inside out, and when your body finally stops moving, that wet layer turns you into a meat popsicle with a slow, miserable death clock. The old-timers had a saying for it. If you sweat, you die. Not always literally, but the principle held. Sweating was a luxury you couldn't afford unless you had the means to dry off immediately. And usually you didn't. There were no saunas out here, no towels, just wind, snow, and the knowledge that once your core temperature dropped, the slope got slippery fast. So how did they handle it? Simple. They learned to move slow, efficient. Pacing wasn't laziness, it was science. You didn't sprint through drifts like a hero in a survival movie. You trudged, steady, breathable. You unlayered before moving. Before, not after. If you knew you had a steep climb or a hard job coming up, you'd strip down a layer or two, even if it meant starting out chilly. Better cold and dry than warm and wet. That was the rule. Some trappers went shirtless under their coats during hard labour, even in brutal conditions. Just a thin base layer to catch the sweat, a coat rolled in their pack to put on later. Because once the work was done and you cooled down, you needed dry clothing fast. Otherwise, that thin layer of sweat-soaked cloth became an icy death wrap. It wasn't about comfort. It was about timing, anticipation, knowing your body so well that you could feel the moment before sweat started and adjust. Not after, before. And if you did sweat, because sometimes you had to hustle or got caught on a slope or just misjudged, there was a protocol. Shed the wet clothes, immediately, wipe down with anything dry, snow even. Yes, snow. Some trappers would rub snow on their skin to wick away moisture and reset their body temperature. It sounds insane, but it worked. Cold snow absorbs heat and moisture faster than cloth in some cases, and it's better to feel frozen for 5 minutes than wet and freezing for hours. Here's a fringe technique not everyone used, but the ones who did swore by it. The venting layer. They'd slit small holes under their armpits or along their back seams to let steam escape during motion. Usually hidden under a cloak or coat, these little cuts weren't for fashion. They were functionally early pit zips. Think about that. No zippers, no Gore-Tex, just controlled cuts in leather or wool to let heat bleed out as they moved. Ugly? Maybe. Effective? Absolutely. There's debate among modern historians about how conscious and systematic all this was. Some say mountain men operated mostly on instinct, adjusting as they went, learning through brutal trial and error. Others argue that many had finely honed routines, influenced by native practices and passed down like unwritten code. When to strip, when to stop, when to let yourself cool. Either way, it's clear they knew the stakes. Out here, sweating was like lighting a fuse. You had to manage the burn or the explosion wasn't far behind. And it didn't stop with clothing. Packs and gear were arranged to minimise effort. Heavy loads were balanced, not slung wildly across shoulders. Tools were kept handy to avoid fumbling. They used sleds, pack animals, or dragging methods when they could. Anything to conserve energy and avoid unnecessary heat build-up. It was all about energy economics. Spend just enough to stay alive, never more than you can pay back in warmth. The same applied to fire building. They didn't chop down trees like lunatics in the snow. They gathered standing deadwood, broken limbs, old pine knots soaked in resin. Quick to light, quick to burn. Efficient, not flashy, no wasted effort, because every ounce of movement cost heat, and every drop of sweat invited cold to sink its claws in deeper. And here's the kicker. Sweat doesn't feel dangerous, until it is. That's the real trick of it. You don't notice the wetness until you stop moving. Then suddenly you're freezing, not shivering, locking up. That's when the danger's already halfway done with you. Your clothes are damp, your skin is clammy. You can't light a fire because your fingers won't grip the flint. Your boots are icy. Your breath feels short. And then you panic. That's how it starts. The smart trappers knew how to prevent that spiral. At the first hint of sweat, they stopped, opened their coat, peeled back a layer, rested, not for luxury, but for control. The cold isn't a fight you win in a single blow. It's an opponent you outlast inch by frozen inch. So now picture yourself crouching by a tree, pulling your mittens off to cool your hands, your shirt flapping open as you catch your breath. Snow clings to your boots. You're not moving. Not yet. You're just letting the heat ebb off before it becomes a problem. It's uncomfortable, but that discomfort is smarter than pride. You'll warm up again later. Right now, you're staying dry. Because the mountain men didn't conquer winter with fire and bravado. They did it with restraint, with caution, with the quiet knowledge that in the cold you don't just manage your warmth, you manage your own body like a volatile tool. And if you ever forget that, the snow is always happy to remind you. You're up early, way before the sun. The fire's down to a handful of coals, your breath is fogging the air in soft plumes, and everything around you glows blue and silver with pre-dawn frost. It's quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears. Not the hush of city morning or a lazy forest in spring, but something deeper, heavier. The kind of silence that holds secrets. Out here, they call it the white silence. No birdsong, no rustling, just you, the snow, and the sound of your boots compressing powder as you follow the trail. You're tracking. Something moved through here while you slept. Maybe a rabbit. Maybe something bigger. In cold country, you don't need fresh eyes to see. You need sharp ones. And mountain men were masters of that particular skill. Tracking through snow, yes, but more than that. Reading the land. Understanding the language of shadow, texture, and the faint disturbances that most people walk right over without noticing. Because in the snow, everything leaves a trace. But not everything is what it looks like. Take prints, for example. Everyone thinks they're obvious. Clear as day, right there in the snow. But in reality, snow is fickle. A perfect print at dawn can be a half-melted smear by noon. Or worse, a double exposure of wind-drifted flakes and thawed outlines that tell you exactly nothing if you don't know how to read between the lines. Mountain men learn to read a track like a newspaper. How deep is it? How clean? Is there a spray of powder where the animal kicked off? That means it was moving fast. If not, it might have been walking, or creeping. They touch the edge of the print with a bare finger. Risky, but necessary. Cold means the track is fresh. Still sharp, might be within the hour, starting to collapse. Older. If it had a thin crust over it, it was left before the last snow or during the night and has since hardened. All of that gives clues, not just about the animal, but how far away it is right now. And here's where it gets fascinating. Snow doesn't just preserve prints, it tells a story. A broken twig, freshly snapped and resting on the crust. A disturbance in the wind pattern, where something large passed. Scat, barely frozen. Blood, always a big one, still red against the white, or turning brown at the edges. Each of these is a timestamp, a marker. Some trappers could piece together an entire scene from half a dozen broken flakes and a hair caught on bark. One fringe technique practiced by the most experienced, or maybe just the most obsessive, was reading air trails. That's right. Watching how steam from your breath moved through shaded hollows and valleys, trying to catch the trail of disturbed air left by a moving body. Large animals, or humans, can change airflow in narrow places. It's subtle, incredibly subtle. But in perfectly still cold you sometimes see it. A shimmer, a faint flicker of warm air passing through like heat waves over pavement. Trappers didn't call it science, they just called it good eyes. Then there was the question of pattern. You didn't just follow tracks, you read behaviour. Was the trail straight and purposeful? That meant the animal, or person, was travelling. Zigzagging, probably feeding. Pausing often with deep impressions. Maybe resting, or wounded. If it circled back on itself, watch out. That could mean it's watching you. Predators do that. People too. And not all tracks were left by four-legged creatures. Sometimes the ones you found were boot prints, or moccasin. That got real serious, real fast. You could tell a lot about a man from his tracks. The depth, the spread, the stride length. Walking carefully. He's alert, moving fast, fleeing something, limping, wounded. You might not even see the man, but you know him, like a signature in the snow. There's an open debate among historians and outdoorsmen about just how much of this is myth and how much is real. Could mountain men really track like that, with near supernatural precision? Or is it just lore sharpened over time? The answer, as usual, is somewhere in the middle. No, they didn't read minds through snowprints. But when you spend your entire life in the wilderness, depending on your eyes, your ears, your gut, you get very good at noticing the details. Noticing is survival. And here's something you might not expect. Sound plays a role in tracking too. In deep snow, especially when the temperature's below zero, noise travels farther, much farther. Mountain men knew that. They'd pause often while tracking, not just to catch their breath, but to listen. Sometimes you hear a tail swish, a branch snap, sometimes nothing, but that nothing, that pattern of absence can be its own clue. Even shadows tell stories. In the low light of winter, shadows are long and crisp. A broken pattern in the light on snow might mean something disturbed the area. You can follow shadows like a compass, reading where things pass through, even if the prints themselves have gone soft. It's not glamorous. It's not like in the movies. There's no sudden flash of genius where the tracker leaps up and says, "He went that way." Number. It's slow, hunched over, eyes narrowed, fingers stiff. You're moving one step at a time, constantly recalculating. You stop often, kneel, scan. Smell the air, feel the snow, you become part of the terrain, half man, half ghost. Sometimes the trail goes cold, the wind scours it away, or the snow gets too deep, or the creature you're tracking knows you're there and starts leaving false trails. That happened too. Wolves doubling back, coyotes circling, rival trappers laying misleading signs to protect their caches. It was a game, and it could turn deadly. But when you did follow the trail all the way to the end, when you crouched behind a tree and saw the movement ahead, the deer grazing or the smoke curling from a hidden camp, you felt like you'd pulled a thread through the entire fabric of the forest. Because that's what tracking is, a way of stitching yourself into the cold, white world, following signs that no one else sees, because you've trained yourself to read the frozen language that snow never stops writing. So next time you see snow falling softly outside your window, think about this. There are stories landing in your yard, one flake at a time. Stories of foxes, owls, dogs, people. Most of us just leave footprints and walk away. But the mountain men, they stayed and read. Because in the white silence, if you know what to look for, the world never stops talking. You haven't seen another soul in days, maybe weeks. Just snow, endless trees, and the sound of your own boots crunching over crusted powder. You start to feel like the only thing alive out here, until, just before dawn, you hear it. A howl. Long, rising, almost musical. It echoes through the valley and makes the hairs on your neck stand up. It's not close, not yet, but it's near enough to remind you that you're not alone. Wolves. The mountain men didn't fear them exactly, but they watched them, studied them, because wolves knew things about cold that no human ever fully mastered. And if you paid attention to them, you might just make it through the winter with all your fingers still attached. Wolves aren't just survivors, they're specialists. Designed by nature to thrive in cold, they move, eat, rest, and even breathe in ways that conserve energy and outsmart the freeze. So what did the mountain men learn from them? More than you'd expect. Out here, with no books, no thermometers, and no second chances, observation was science. And wolves were some of the best teachers. Start with movement. Wolves don't rush. Even when they're hunting, their pace is calculated. Efficient. One step after another, paws falling in their own tracks, minimizing energy use and avoiding unnecessary floundering in deep snow. Mountain men mimicked this. You don't slog wildly through snowdrifts. You move with rhythm, choosing your steps carefully, keeping your body low, distributing your weight like a four-legged predator would. If you've ever seen old snowshoe tracks left by a seasoned trapper, they almost look lazy, dragging one foot lightly through the powder instead of lifting it high. But it's not laziness, it's economy. Wolves taught them that. Then there's resting. Wolves don't dig big pits or make elaborate shelters. They curl up in a spot with a good windbreak, usually on the leeward side of a hill or beneath a thick stand of trees, and let the snow bury them slightly. That snow, as we've talked about, becomes insulation. Mountain men noticed. They began sleeping like wolves, tucked into snow hollows or against rock faces with their blankets wrapped tight, using the wind's patterns instead of fighting them. There's a fringe account from an 1820s trapper named Latham, never became famous, but his journal survived, where he describes watching a lone wolf bed down during a blizzard. The wolf didn't panic, didn't run, just circled once, laid down in a drift and let the snow cover its back. Latham tried it, dug a shallow trench, curled up with his buffalo robe and let the storm bury him. Woke up warmer than he'd been in days. He wrote, "The wolf is wiser than the fire tonight. And wolves didn't just teach you how to sleep, they taught you what to expect. Their movements foretold weather. If they were quiet, moving low through the woods, something was changing. Storms coming, maybe. If they howled for hours, long into the morning, something was off. Mountain men learned to listen, not just for the sound, but for the tone. Some swore they could predict a cold snap by the pitch of a midnight howl. Superstition? Maybe. But after a few years out here, anything that kept you alive started to feel like fact. Another lesson. Teamwork. Wolves never wander alone unless they have to. They move in packs, watching each other, backing each other up. And while the image of the lone mountain man is popular, most didn't actually travel solo for long stretches. They paired up, grouped with other trappers or native guides, not because they were soft, but because they were smart. In the deep cold, you need another set of eyes. Another body by the fire. Someone to spot frostbite before it takes hold. Wolves get that. So did the men who paid attention. Now let's talk food. Wolves are lean hunters. They don't waste. Every part of a kill gets used. Meat, organs, bones, even fur. Mountain men followed suit. If you shot a deer, you didn't just take the backstrap and leave the rest. You rendered fat, boiled bones, roasted marrow, stripped sinew. You even used the stomach to carry water if needed. Waste was weakness. Wolves knew it. So did the men. There's also the way wolves conserve energy. They don't fight unless they have to. They don't run unless the odds are in their favour. They avoid exposure. Same with mountain men. You don't go out into a blizzard to check traps unless you're desperate. You hunker down, you wait, you observe. That's not cowardice, that's cold wisdom. And wolves were clean, believe it or not. They licked wounds, kept their dens orderly, rolled in snow to scrub themselves down. Mountain men, as rough and greasy as they appeared, did the same in their own way. They melted snow to wash hands, used ashes to scrub gear, rubbed snow into their hair and beards to remove grime. Not out of vanity, but because filth leads to illness, and illness out here often meant death. A man who ignored cleanliness wouldn't last 2 winters. There's an open debate in wilderness circles today about just how much we can or should learn from animals in terms of survival. Some say we romanticize them, imagine intention where there's just instinct. But others argue the opposite, that instinct is wisdom, evolved and refined over generations. Wolves don't read weather maps, they don't check wind chill, but they survive winter after winter, using the same land, the same snow, the same wind we do. So maybe the mountain men weren't romanticizing the wolves at all. Maybe they were just finally learning to listen. And then there's the eyes. You never forget the first time you make eye contact with a wolf in the wild. It's not a threat, not quite curiosity, it's recognition. You're both out here, both trying to survive, both burning calories just to stay warm and breathing. And in that look there's a kind of unspoken agreement. We're not enemies, just neighbours in the cold. One last odd bit. Some trappers believed sleeping with your feet toward the wind, like wolves often do, helped keep you alive. The wind hits your soles, not your chest or head, keeping core heat in. Others took it further, sleeping in a curled posture with arms crossed and chin tucked, mimicking a wolf's rest pose. Not comfy, but warmer, efficient. So tonight, As the wind starts to pick up and you're laying under a pile of blankets that smell faintly of wood smoke and wet leather, remember the wolves. Think of the ones you didn't see, ghosting silently through the trees curled in snowbanks, howling not out of loneliness but communication. They were the original survivalists. No gear, no fire, no Gore-Tex. Just instinct, adaptation, and a long history of listening to the land. The mountain men didn't fear the wolves, they followed them, and if you're smart, you'll do the same. You wake to a sound, not the snapping of a twig or the distant howl of a wolf, something closer, softer, the quiet, wet hiss of snow sliding off a branch. Then it hits you, the smell, wet leather, damp fur, smoke that never fully caught. Your bedroll is clammy. Your gloves, which you tucked near the fire to dry, are stiff again, the fingers curled and crusted with frost. You groan, stretch, and realise something terrible. Everything is damp. Not soaked, just not dry. And in this kind of cold, not dry is the prelude to disaster. Mountain men understood this better than most. Dry before you die. It wasn't a motto, not exactly. Just a truth, lived daily and enforced by frostbite, ruined gear, and the brutal knowledge that once your clothing turned wet in the winter, your chances dropped fast. It wasn't just about comfort, it was about survival. Because moisture in your gear meant heat loss, weight gain, and a miserable, slow spiral into hypothermia. Think about it. Your gloves get damp with sweat while you're working. You take them off for a minute to strike a flint or tie a knot. The inside starts freezing while you're distracted. Put them back on and they're no longer insulation, they're ice sleeves. Your moccasins soak through from the snow you didn't brush off before crawling into camp. Now your socks are wet and your feet, they're on a countdown. It doesn't take much. So drying gear was a ritual. Every night, even if you were tired, even if the fire was weak, even if the cold made your fingers feel like sausages left in a freezer too long. You built that fire, small, smart, just hot enough to steam off moisture without cooking the hide. You peeled off what you could, turned it inside out and propped it near the flames. Not on them, that's key. Burn your gloves, and you'll wish the cold had just taken your hands. They had tricks, of course. Sticks placed in notches to make little drying racks. Stones heated in the fire and then tucked into boots to dry the inside slowly. Even hanging items from the tripod over your cookpot to take advantage of rising steam. One fringe method, using your own body heat. Some mountain men, when desperate, would sleep with damp clothing inside their blankets, letting their bodies slowly dry the fabric overnight. Miserable, risky. But if you managed the layers right and rotated gear properly, it worked. You learned to never let things get wet in the first place if you could help it. Snow got brushed off constantly, coats shaken out before entering shelter, tools wiped dry before stowing. Mountain men didn't wait until gear was soaked. They fought moisture at every turn. Prevention wasn't just smart, it was sacred. There's a recurring image in trapper journals. A lone man sitting by a fire, bare-chested, his shirt steaming on a stick, a pair of socks flapping lightly in the smoke. He's not posing, he's recovering, and he knows every moment by that fire is borrowed time. Soon the wind will shift, the coals will die, the world will go back to white and silent, and his gear has to be ready when it does. Some trappers carried extra pairs of socks, mittens, even shirts. Wool, mostly, or soft-tanned hides. Not because they liked to pack heavy, but because one dry item could mean everything. You couldn't always count on fire, couldn't always count on sun, but you could count on the cold. It would always be there, waiting to creep into damp seams, freeze the cuffs of your sleeves, turn your belt stiff and brittle. Here's an odd historical debate. Did mountain men have drying days? That is, did they stop and do nothing but dry out, once every so often, even if the weather was clear? Some evidence suggests yes, at least among the more experienced. They'd pitch camp early, build a bigger fire and unpack everything. Hang it, flip it, shake it. If they had hides or tents, they'd rig makeshift shelters and let the sun do its work. Not glamorous, not productive, but essential. Even seasoned trappers wrote about a day to thaw and steam, after too many cold nights on the move. Now picture this. You've spent 2 days crossing icy ridges. You slipped once into a stream, just ankle deep, but enough to soak your moccasins. You kept going. No time to stop. No dry wood. That night, you huddled in damp socks and cursed your decisions. The next morning, Your boots are frozen solid, your toes numb. You have to light a fire just to get your footwear pliable enough to put on. Meanwhile, your pants have stiffened into leather tubes and your gloves, well, they might be done for, all because you didn't dry when you had the chance. Sometimes you didn't get another chance. One fringe solution that actually worked. Oil. Trappers treated their leather gear with animal fat or bear grease not just for waterproofing, but to slow absorption. A well-oiled pair of moccasins would resist snow longer. A buckskin shirt rubbed with tallow wouldn't soak up every snowflake like a sponge. Again, you smelled like a butcher shop, but you stayed dry. Priorities. And of course, not all drying was physical. Some of it was mental. You dried out yourself by the fire, let the tension melt from your shoulders, let your breath slow, your fingers unthaw. You sat with your feet bare and your legs steaming and for once didn't rush. Because this moment, this drying time, it was your reset button. It was how you started again, and mountain men treasured it. You could always make more snares, you could always mend a coat, but if the cold got you, if it soaked you to the bone and found you without flame, you were done. So tonight, think about your routine. Toss your wet clothes in a hamper, kick off your shoes and slide into clean sheets. But imagine, just for a moment, that you couldn't. That your warmth depended on your diligence. That every night before rest you had to make sure your gear was ready. Not pretty, not perfect, just dry. Because in the world of the mountain men, staying dry wasn't the reward for surviving, it was the reason you did. The snow's coming down hard now, flakes like little glass blades, dry and sharp, stinging your cheeks every time the wind shifts. It's been falling all morning, and it's not the soft storybook kind. This is the heavy, steady kind that stacks fast and means business, the kind that buries your gear if you blink too long. But you're not huddled by the fire, you're not taking shelter. You're heading out because your traps are set and the wilderness doesn't stop working just because the sky's having a tantrum. Traps don't take snow days, and if you want to eat or have anything worth trading, you'd better not either. The mountain men were trappers before they were anything else. Their entire livelihood depended on steel traps, clever placements, and long, exhausting trap lines that looped through valleys, along creeks, and deep into thickets that most people would think twice about entering even in summer. These men didn't check their traps on sunny afternoons with a full stomach. They did it in the brutal cold, in sleet, in blizzards, in the kind of silence that can feel like a warning. Because every day you leave a trap unchecked is a day you risk losing the catch to scavengers, rot, or just plain bad luck. Most trap lines weren't short. A good run could stretch over 10, even 20 miles, depending on terrain and how ambitious or desperate the trapper was. You'd wake before dawn, eat a hunk of cold meat or leftover stew if you were lucky, strap on your snowshoes and head out. You didn't wait for the storm to stop. You just dressed for it, read the wind, and adjusted your layers like a man going to war. The traps themselves were a mix of steel-jawed designs, deadfalls, snares, whatever worked. Most were set along predictable animal routes, creeks, beaver runs, game trails, narrow choke points where animals were likely to pass through. In winter, snow actually helped. Tracks told you which lines were still active, which needed resetting, which animals were avoiding your scent. You'd study them like a detective, paw prints by a sprung trap. Maybe you were too early. Blood and disturbed snow, that's a catch, if something hasn't beaten you to it. Because the cold doesn't just test your body, it tests your timing. Leave a rabbit in a trap too long, and it becomes a popsicle. And then something else comes along, fox, coyote, wolverine, and eats half of it. Or drags the trap away completely. That's one of the brutal ironies out here. Catch an animal, and you're still racing the clock to claim it before nature does. You needed discipline. You couldn't afford to be sentimental or sloppy. Traps had to be checked daily, even if your fingers were cracked, even if your boots were frozen. Some trappers claimed they could set and reset a steel trap with mittens on. Most couldn't, but they tried. Because pulling your gloves off in 10 below weather to reset a spring could cost you skin, dexterity, or worse. And if you lost the use of your fingers, that was a death sentence wrapped in frost. There's a fringe method, not commonly discussed, but it made the rounds in certain trapping circles. Warming traps before setting them. Men would tuck smaller traps under their coats, or near the fire briefly, warming the metal so it wouldn't chill the bait, or give off a scent animals might detect. Sounds odd, but in extreme cold, metal smells different. Sharp, unnatural. Anything to mask that edge was worth trying. Some even rubbed tallow on traps not just for scent but to prevent ice buildup on the springs. The traps weren't just tools, they were investments. Steel was expensive, heavy. If you lost one, you felt it. Some trappers carried only half a dozen, resetting them as they moved, leapfrogging through the wilderness like a grim scavenger hunt. Others carried dozens, running an efficient line like a man operating his own silent, deadly factory across the forest. Now let's talk about beaver, because if there was a crown jewel of the trapline, this was it. Beaver pelts were gold in the fur trade. Warm, durable, water-resistant. Mountain men followed beaver sign like treasure maps, setting traps in freezing creeks, dam outlets, and feeding channels. Which meant, yes, sometimes you were in the water, even when it was barely liquid. Some men used long poles to place traps. Others waded in, rolled up to their knees in soaked leather and sheer madness. They wore gloves soaked in beaver oil to hide their scent, bent low in the snow, and worked with the kind of speed born only of necessity. One mistake. You snap a trap on your hand, you're done for the day, if not longer. You ever tried freeing your own fingers from a steel trap with one hand in freezing cold? It's not just painful, it's humiliating. There are stories, half true and mostly tragic, of trappers forced to break frozen digits just to escape their own gear. Which is why the smart ones moved slow, double-checked every step, and talked to themselves as they worked. Not because they were crazy, but because focus kept you alive. There's some debate among historians about how cruel these traplines were, whether the men saw them as ruthless necessities, or if they truly respected the animals they harvested. The truth, as always, lives in the middle. Trappers relied on the land, and most didn't waste what they caught. They used the meat, the fat, the bones, the pelts, of course. But did they grieve every animal? Number. Not in the way we think. They honoured the process. They respected it. Because they knew how thin the line was between predator and prey, and that it could change fast. Some even left offerings, scraps of food, a whispered word, a carved token. Not always, not often, but enough to be remembered. And yet the cold made everything harder. Traps iced over, bait froze, springs lost tension. You carried a hatchet not just for protection, but to chip out traps frozen into the ground. Some men wore rawhide gloves for this purpose, not because they were warm, but because they could take a beating. Others used heated knives to cut frozen cords. Every tool was a negotiation between usefulness and whether your hands could still use it. When you finally returned to camp hours later, with a sack of pelts stiff as boards and fingers that could barely untie a knot, you didn't feel triumphant. You felt relieved. You made it. You'd eat. Maybe even trade. That night by the fire you'd rub your hands with grease, lay your traps near the coals to thaw, and already begin planning tomorrow's run. Because out here, the wilderness doesn't stop, the snow doesn't care, and the trapline is never done. It waits in the cold, silent and hungry, just like everything else. Your lips are cracked. Your hands shake when you reach for your canteen. You tip it back, hoping for water, but all you get is a hollow clink, frozen solid. The ice inside rattles like old bones. Not surprising. The temperatures haven't climbed above freezing in days, and even your breath feels like it's crystallizing in your throat. You think about melting snow, but you're tired. The fire's low, and what you really want isn't water anyway. It's fat. You want grease, tallow, even a spoonful of that grey glistening pemmican you've been hoarding in the bottom of your pack. Because the mountain men knew what we've mostly forgotten. In cold country, you don't drink to hydrate, you fuel to survive. And sometimes that means drinking fat. It sounds wrong, doesn't it? Counterintuitive. After all, modern advice is all about hydration. Water, electrolytes, sipping constantly. But out here, in the heart of winter, your body isn't sweating. It's burning. Every breath, every step, every shiver is costing you heat and calories. The danger isn't dehydration, it's energy loss. If your core temperature drops too far, it won't matter how much water you've had. You'll freeze from the inside out. That's why the old-timers didn't just sip water, they fed themselves warmth. High-calorie, fat-rich, slow-burning sustenance that kept the fire lit inside. Let's back up. The typical day for a mountain man involved miles of hiking, snowshoeing, chopping wood, setting traps, hauling gear and building camp, all in sub-zero temperatures. That kind of labour burns through energy like a brush fire, and protein alone doesn't cut it. Lean meat gives you strength, sure, but it won't keep you warm. Fat, on the other hand, is the long-burning log on your internal fire. It digests slowly, warms your organs, and fuels your muscles for the long haul, so they drank it. Literally. Not in some butter-in-coffee hipster way. We're talking about boiling bones for hours until the marrow leaked out, skimming the fat off the top and sipping it like soup. They'd melt strips of bear fat or bison tallow into broth, or stir spoonfuls of rendered grease into snowmelt to create a kind of makeshift stew. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't tasty, but it kept you alive. One fringe recipe that makes the rounds in old journals is grease tea, a name that oversells it. Basically it's hot water with animal fat melted in. Sometimes a pinch of dried mint or pine needle for flavour, other times nothing. It looks like pond scum. It feels like drinking warm candle wax. But it gets the job done. Trappers swore it kept their extremities warmer, gave them longer bursts of energy, and staved off what they called snow weakness, that slow, creeping fatigue that tells you hypothermia is coming. Now, that's not to say mountain men ignored water altogether. They still needed to hydrate, but they did it smart. No gulping icy streams, no crunching mouthfuls of snow. You always melt first. Always. Even if it means wasting precious firewood. Even if it means waiting an extra hour before heading out. Cold water steals heat from your core faster than almost anything, and once that internal furnace starts cooling, it's hard to get back. Some used a clever trick, tucking snow into a cloth pouch and hanging it near the fire, letting it drip slowly into a cup. Others kept a leather bladder inside their coat during the day, using their own body heat to keep the water just above freezing. If you've never sipped water that tastes like sweat and leather, but is somehow still the best thing you've had in days, you haven't lived like a mountain man. Another key? Timing. You drank or ate your fat-heavy meals at the right moments, not during peak exertion, never while actively moving. That was a recipe for cramps, nausea, or worse. No, you fueled up before heading out and again after returning to camp. You timed your fat intake like a man stoking a stove. Regular, measured, just enough to keep things burning steady. There's a lot of modern discussion around keto and high-fat diets now, but the trappers didn't care about macros or metabolic states. They just knew what worked. They saw what happened to men who ate too lean. You'd think fresh deer or rabbit would be a blessing, but without fat, it was deadly. You could starve eating only lean meat. It's called rabbit starvation, and more than one overeager greenhorn learned the hard way that meat alone doesn't save you. You need fat. You crave it. Your body demands it in the cold. There's a story about a trapper named Cyrus who supposedly survived a 3-day storm eating nothing but melted bear fat and pine tea. His partner had fresh venison but refused the grease. By day 2, he couldn't move. By day 3, he was delirious. Cyrus, greasy and grim, pulled through. Not because he was tougher, just smarter. The fat kept his fire burning when everything else was frozen solid. Mountain men didn't talk about digestion or caloric density. They talked about belly fire, about feeling the warmth spread after a meal. You'd sip your grease tea, feel it hit your stomach like a coal dropped in water and know you'd bought yourself another few hours. Long enough to get the next trap checked. Long enough to get wood chopped. Long enough to see another sunset. And yes, sometimes they got it wrong. Fat could spoil. Rancid tallow made you sick. Too much all at once could backfire, cause vomiting, weakness, or the runs, which were especially dangerous in the cold, so you had to know your limits, know your gut, know your balance. Some men added dried berries or bits of bark to cut the grease. Others chased it with hot broth or a mouthful of snow, just enough to settle things. There's debate even now about whether we could replicate this diet today. Would modern stomachs tolerate it? Is it necessary with modern gear? Maybe not. But when you're living by firelight, days from the nearest outpost, with the wind carving lines into your skin, fat isn't a luxury. It's currency. It's armour. It's your invisible winter coat. So tonight, when you sip your hot tea or slurp your 3rd cup of whatever warm drink you've got going, remember this. Once upon a time, a man crouched in the snow, his fingers cracked and his face wind-burned, sipping melted bear fat from a tin cup and thanking the gods he'd kept it from spoiling. It didn't taste good, but it brought him a little more life. Out here, that's all you can ask for. You're huddled in your shelter, if you can even call it that. A sloped roof of pine boughs lashed together with rawhide, snow stacked around the sides for insulation, and a thin trail of smoke sneaking out a gap at the top. The fire's down to coals, the wind outside sounds like it's trying to peel the forest off the mountain, and you're sitting there, knees tucked to your chest, staring into the red glow with a numb face and stinging fingers, and somehow against every instinct and expectation you're not panicking. You're okay, not happy, not comfortable, but your heart isn't racing, you're not spiralling, because mountain men knew something we've forgotten. The weather isn't your enemy, it's just the weather. And out here there's no such thing as bad weather, only unprepared minds. It's a different kind of toughness, one that has nothing to do with bravado. It's not the shouting kind, it's the kind you whisper to yourself when your boots freeze overnight, and you have to put them on anyway. It's the kind you carry in your gut when your only food left is half a cup of frozen bear grease, and a strip of jerky so tough you could patch a tent with it. It's the kind that mountain men had to develop just to exist out here for more than a few days. And the cold, the blizzards, the ice in your beard, the snow in your bedroll, the wind clawing at your clothes until the seams give out, that wasn't bad weather. That was just Tuesday. Most people today think of extreme cold as something to be avoided at all costs. Stay indoors, cancel plans, postpone the hike. But out here in the wilderness, there's no pausing for the weather. If you waited for a clear day, you'd starve to death in a dry shelter full of unused traps. So the mountain men flipped the script. They stopped asking the cold to be kind. They started asking themselves to be ready. This readiness wasn't just about gear. Sure, having warm clothes and a dry fire bundle helps, but gear fails. It gets wet. It breaks. You lose it crossing a stream, or a fox runs off with your mittens while you sleep. Yes, it's happened. When that happens, your survival depends on what's between your ears. Your attitude toward the cold becomes your first line of defense. Here's what they knew. The cold isn't personal. It doesn't hate you. It doesn't care about you at all. That realization, harsh as it is, can be freeing. Because once you stop trying to fight the cold like it's an enemy, you start learning how to work with it. You pace yourself. You learn its rhythms. You read the sky, watch the animals, and notice the way your own breath feels when a front is moving in. The stoicism of the mountain men wasn't just about enduring, it was about adapting. There's a story about a trapper who once cut a finger badly in the middle of winter, blood soaking through his mittens before he could even react. He didn't panic. He packed the wound with snow, wrapped it in rabbit hide, and went on with his day. When asked later why he didn't head back to camp, he just shrugged. "Can't untrap a beaver with one hand, but I can walk with it," he said. That's the mindset. It's not about ignoring discomfort. Mountain men hated the cold just like anyone would, but they didn't dwell on it. They compartmentalized. Pain was information. If your ears burned, it meant you were still alive. If your feet tingled, you needed to check your socks. If you couldn't feel your nose anymore, well, time to build a fire. Each sensation was a signal, and instead of panicking, they listened. There's some debate among survival psychologists about how much of this mindset was intentional versus a byproduct of necessity. Did mountain men consciously build mental toughness, or was it just survival pressure reshaping their brains? The answer doesn't really matter out here. Whether you choose to be tough or have to be, the result is the same. You learn to meet the cold on its terms, not yours. And here's the fringe part that's almost hard to believe. Some mountain men came to love the cold, or at least prefer it. No mosquitoes, no rot, no mould. The snow covered up the smell of death and the stink of old camps. It preserved meat. It made tracking easier. Some swore they could sleep better in sub-zero temps than during spring's mud and mess. There's a kind of peace in the stillness of winter, a purity. You're not fighting chaos, you're navigating silence. The mental game extended into routine. Start the day with tasks that warmed the body. Fire building, wood chopping. Keep the mind busy with simple, repeatable actions. Sharpening tools, adjusting snowshoes, melting snow for broth. They didn't sit and brood. That was when the cold crept in, not just under your coat, but into your thoughts. Ever hear of cabin fever? It's real, and it was a killer. Being snowed in wasn't just physically dangerous, it was mentally suffocating. That's why mountain men stayed active, even inside. They repaired gear, made fishing lines from sinew, carved, wrote in journals if they had paper. One man spent an entire winter alone, and kept himself sane by memorizing every verse of the Bible he could remember. Another taught himself to whistle bird calls and passed hours communicating with owls. Odd? Sure, but effective. You keep your brain moving, or it starts turning on you. They also talk to themselves, constantly. Some trappers admitted it in their journals. In the absence of company, they became their own audience, muttering through tasks, reciting routines, arguing with imaginary partners. It wasn't madness, it was management. The cold isolates you, and the silence becomes a weight. You talk to stay human. You talk to keep the cold from swallowing your mind whole. Mountain men also leaned into humour. Dark, biting humour. The kind of jokes you tell when your last piece of soap froze to your face, or when you find a squirrel curled up inside your spare shirt. It wasn't just entertainment, it was armour. Laughter pushes back against despair. A man who can make fun of his frozen boots isn't beaten by them yet. So tonight, while you pull your blanket a little tighter and shiver at the draft sneaking in through your window, remember the lesson mountain men lived by. The cold doesn't care. It won't bargain or bend. But if you prepare for it, if you expect discomfort, if you don't take it personally, you've already beaten half the battle. There's no such thing as bad weather, only weather that finds you unready. It's getting late. You've been moving since sunup, the sky's fading fast into that smoky winter blue, and you're still a few miles from camp. The wind's shifting, colder now, sharper. You feel it in your teeth, in the way the trees creak overhead like old floorboards settling. You tell yourself you've got time, just a little farther, but your gut is starting to say otherwise, and that's the voice the mountain men always listen to. Because if there's one rule that sat above all the others, one commandment whispered from trapper to greenhorn like a sacred truth, it was this: make camp before sunset. Always, no exceptions. It sounds like common sense. It even sounds easy, until you're the one out there, misjudging the trail, chasing one more trap, pushing for one more hour of daylight. That's how the cold gets you. Not with a blizzard or a bear, but with your own impatience. Your belief that you've got just enough time to finish the job. The mountain men. They learned early that cold country doesn't give you extra minutes. When the sun dips, the temperature crashes and it doesn't ask if you're ready. So they plan their days around the light. Not their energy, not their ambition, the light. You could have the strength of an ox and lungs like a forge bellows, but if you were still wandering through a frozen forest in the dark looking for shelter or dry wood, none of that mattered. Because in winter, night doesn't just fall, it slams down. And out here, darkness isn't just a lack of vision, it's a predator in its own right. Mountain men aim to have their shelters up, fire started, and bedding unrolled at least an hour before true sunset. They called it camping on light, a window of safety that let them settle without panic. It gave them time to find the best spot, check for widowmakers above, those dead branches that snap off in the wind, gather firewood, and get water melted while they could still see their own hands. Because once the dark comes, everything gets 10 times harder. Your knife slips, your flint misses, your fingers don't work, and the wolves start sounding a lot closer. This wasn't a gentle lesson. It was one often learned by experience. The journals are full of grim little notes from men who camped late and paid the price. A fire that wouldn't start. Snow too deep to clear. A bedroll soaked from being thrown down too hastily. Or worse, no shelter at all. Just a makeshift windbreak, one blanket, and a night spent curled up praying for the sun. You survive it once, maybe twice. But after that, you make camp early, even if it cost you a trap or two. There's one tale, possibly true, definitely repeated, about a young trapper named Henley who kept pushing his luck. Made camp at dusk 3 days in a row. First night he lost a mitten and nearly frostbit his thumb. Second night he burned his coat sleeve trying to rush a fire. Third night he didn't make camp at all. Snow squall blew in. He curled up under a spruce and didn't wake up until morning. When he did, his boots were frozen solid, and he'd lost the feeling in both feet. Made it back, barely. Never made the same mistake again. The fringe trick some old-timers used was a time marker system, landmarks and rhythms built into their routes. If I pass the split rock by mid-afternoon, I've got time. If I don't see the crooked pine by first shade, I camp. They didn't carry watches. They carried awareness. They used the sun's angle, the chill in the air, the behaviour of animals. Birds would go quiet. Squirrels would disappear. Even the wolves hushed down as night crept in. And it wasn't just about the fire. Making camp meant preparing everything. You didn't just throw down your gear and hope for the best. You built a proper fire ring using stones if possible. You cleared snow down to earth, or laid a platform of green logs to keep the fire from melting into a hole. You made a windbreak, not just for comfort, but to protect the flame from gusts. You checked your bedroll, your gear, your flint, your powder horn, because once you're settled you don't want to move. You want to stay warm, dry and still. There's a curious psychological effect that sets in after dark out here. Something trappers knew well. You start making mistakes. Your judgment slips. What seemed like a good idea at noon, a shortcut, a hard push, a quick last stop, feels different in the cold blue of night. Your thoughts turn inward. You stop watching your surroundings. You forget things, tools, footing, which direction you came from. Darkness in the cold isn't just physical, it's mental. It isolates you. That's why the best trappers moved with discipline. Even when they were hungry, even when their traps were full, they turned back early. You leave the last stretch of the line for tomorrow. You skip that extra trail, because the mountain will still be there, but you might not be. Some modern outdoorsmen like to debate whether this rule still applies. With GPS, headlamps, emergency beacons, why worry about the sun? But that's the problem. We don't feel the cold in our bones the way they did. We can fake comfort. They couldn't. So their respect for daylight wasn't paranoia, it was realism. And when the batteries fail or the gear goes down, that realism is what keeps you alive. Tonight, as the sun drops and you flip on a lamp or click up your thermostat, remember what it means to earn warmth. To be chased by the dark and beat it by 20 minutes. To have just enough time to get the fire lit and the kettle on before the stars come out and the world turns deadly quiet. Mountain men didn't fear the night. They just knew better than to meet it unprepared. You've made camp early just like you're supposed to. The fire's steady, your gear's dry, your belly's got a bit of fat-warmed broth sloshing around in it, and your shelter's holding. All signs point to a decent night. But then it starts. First, a twitch in your shoulder, then a shiver down your spine. Your jaw clenches, and before you know it, your whole body is doing a little involuntary two-step. You're not just cold, you're shivering. And if you were most people, you'd probably panic. But out here, among the snow and pines, mountain men understood something the rest of us rarely even think about. Shivering is strategy, not a weakness, not a sign of failure. Shivering, believe it or not, is your body's first line of defense against the cold, a built-in furnace trying to kick itself on. Those muscle tremors. That's your system generating heat the only way it knows how, by moving. Tiny, constant contractions, millions of them, working to warm your core. And the mountain men didn't just accept this, they used it. When the fire burned low, when the wind picked up in the middle of the night, when the frost crept under the edges of your buffalo robe and whispered across your chest, shivering was a cue, a message from your body saying, get up, do something, move before it's too late. Some ignored it and paid for it. Others learned to listen, even lean into it. There's a fringe idea in old journals, passed more as quiet advice than instruction. Let the shiver do its work. In other words, don't fight it right away. Don't clench or panic. Don't rush to bury yourself deeper in your bedding or toss on another blanket and pretend it'll stop. Let your body shake for a bit. Let it warm itself. Then, once you feel that internal heat start to build, then you move to trap it. Some mountain men even used controlled shivering before bed. After working or hiking all day, they'd strip down layers for a few minutes, let the cold kick in, just enough to trigger a good round of tremors. Why? Because that pre-sleep shake started the engine. After that, they'd wrap up tight in dry layers, locking in the fresh heat from within. It was risky. Mess it up and you're just going to bed cold, but done right, it meant a warmer night with less effort. There's a documented example of this from a trapper named Elijah Green, who spent the winter of 1835 in the Bitterroot Range. He wrote that he'd begin each night with what he called the dance, 10 minutes pacing the snow, gloves off, hood down, until the cold set its teeth. Then he'd throw himself into his furs, and by the time he stopped shivering, he was warm enough to sleep. Sounds insane. Probably was insane. But he lived to write about it, and in the cold, survival often looks a lot like madness with a method. It's not just about warming up either. Shivering was a diagnostic tool, a litmus test. Mountain men learned that how you shivered mattered. If it was light and rhythmic, your body still had fuel, still had a fire to stoke. But if the shivering turned violent, spasmodic, if your teeth chattered too hard to speak, that was a red flag. And if it stopped entirely, that was worse. Because when the cold takes over completely and your body no longer even tries to warm itself, that's the threshold where hypothermia slides from risk to reality. They had no medical terms for it, of course, no charts or stages, but they knew the signs. A man who sat too still, who slurred his words, who refused to eat, who laughed at nothing. That was someone the cold had begun to change. And once you crossed that line, even a fire might not be enough. Modern science backs this up. Shivering is your body burning calories in overdrive. Without enough fuel, fat, carbs, protein, it runs out of energy to generate heat. That's why trappers ate late night meals rich in fat right before sleep. Not for comfort, for fuel. So the shivers had something to run on, otherwise you're burning what little reserves you've got left, and by morning, you're ice from the inside out. One clever method mountain men used was group warmth. And yes, it's exactly what you think. In deep cold, you didn't sleep alone. You wrapped up close to your partner, shared a blanket, back to back or chest to chest. Body heat was free, portable, and remarkably effective. Did they like it? Not always. Plenty of grumbling in the journals about snoring in my ear or a knee in the small of my back, but the alternative was waking up as a human icicle. The phrase, "he was warm but unpleasant," comes up more than once in old fur trade accounts. There's a fringe story, possibly apocryphal, about 3 trappers caught in a sudden squall who dug a shallow snow pit and laid down together in a pile, like puppies in a nest. They took turns being in the middle, rotated positions every hour like clockwork. One of them called it shiver shift duty. Nobody died, and though they came out with frozen boots and cracked lips, they came out. That's what mattered. Mountain men also made peace with movement in the night. They'd wake up, feel the chill creeping in, and instead of stubbornly trying to sleep through it, they'd get up, do a few squats, punch their arms against their chest, jump in place, warm the blood, then return to the blanket with a bit of heat already kindled. It wasn't restful, but it was effective. There's an open debate in survival communities today about whether movement or insulation is more important at night. The truth is, both matter. You need insulation to trap heat. But without internal heat to trap, it's worthless. The mountain men solved that by understanding shivering not as failure, but as a tool. Something you could use, time, even trigger, on purpose, to stay ahead of the cold. So now, picture yourself wrapped tight in furs that smell like smoke and old grease, curled under a bent spruce roof, your breath rising in silver curls. You start to tremble. You feel your stomach growl, your hands twitch in your mittens, and instead of panicking, you think, good, the body's still fighting, the engine's still running, shiver, shake, move. Because in the dark heart of winter, the difference between waking up sore and not waking up at all might just be the courage to tremble. You've built your fire, dried your gear, eaten just enough fat to keep your core smouldering, and now it's time for sleep. But out here, sleeping isn't just rest, it's a strategy. A delicate tactical arrangement where warmth is a limited resource and the stakes are higher than comfort. Because in the bitter grip of winter, you don't sleep alone if you can help it, and if you do, you sleep smart. The mountain men didn't just lie down wherever they dropped. They calculated, they positioned, and they understood something essential about survival. Body heat is currency, and how you share it can mean the difference between waking up warm or not waking up at all. In warm weather, you sleep wherever you please. Stretch out under the stars, lean against a tree, maybe hang a hammock if you're feeling fancy. But winter is different. Out here, the cold steals heat like a thief in the dark. One wrong move, too much space between you and your partner, a gap in your bedding, a careless turn that lets the chill creep in, and suddenly your toes are numb and your breath starts to rattle. So mountain men adapted, turning their sleeping arrangements into low-tech, high-survival systems built around heat distribution. If there were 2 of you, you slept close, real close. Not friendly nod from across the campfire close. We're talking face-to-back or back-to-back, under the same blanket or buffalo robe, sharing every degree your bodies could generate. It wasn't about comfort. It wasn't about liking each other. It was about heat economics. Who had it? Who needed it? How could it be shared efficiently? The common setup was the sandwich. If there were 3 men, the one in the middle had the best sleep guaranteed. He got heat from both sides, while the outer two had to deal with wind drafts, cold ground, and maybe a little resentment. They'd rotate positions each night if they were fair-minded, or if the cold got unbearable. Some made rules for it. Others didn't speak a word, just woke up shivering and quietly slid toward the centre during the night. Pride doesn't mean much when your eyelids are frozen shut. There's a strange fringe account of a group of trappers, 4 in total, who used a rotational system over a week-long freeze. They slept in 2 pairs, each with one man's feet at the other's head, creating an L-shaped layout that minimised cold exposure on all sides. They even charted who slept best and which formation preserved the most warmth. Was it scientific? Not even close, but it worked. They made it through one of the worst snowstorms of the decade, and only one man lost a toe, which, by trapper standards, was a win. Now solo sleeping was a different beast. Sometimes you were alone by choice, sometimes by tragedy. Either way, it meant more work. You didn't have a partner to share heat with, so you had to make your own warmth last. The smartest slept inside their gear, not just under it. Mittens tucked inside shirts, extra socks inside boots to keep them pliable. Some wrapped hot stones in leather or hide, heating them by the fire and placing them at their feet or chest before curling in. Others stuffed their spare clothes into the foot of their blanket, adding insulation where it mattered most. And yes, some even slept with their rifles. Not for danger, though that was a bonus, but for warmth. A frozen gun is useless. A warm one fires when you need it. So you slept with it pressed to your side, wrapped in cloth if you had any. You slept with powder horns tucked close, flints in your pocket, blades under your pillow. Not because you were paranoid, because steel gets cold and cold steel fails. Position mattered too. You didn't sprawl, you curled, tight as a hibernating marmot, knees to chest, hands between thighs, elbows in, every inch of skin covered. No gaps. If you moved in your sleep and let a hand fall out of the blanket, you could wake up with frostbite. Some men tied their sleeping roll with a belt or cord to keep it sealed around their body. Not a bad idea when temperatures dipped below 0, and the wind snuck through every seam like a thief looking for flesh. And then there was the bedding. You didn't just lie down on snow or frozen ground. You built a bed, laid down pine boughs, bark, even dry grass if you could find it. Anything to lift yourself off the earth, which acted like a sponge for heat. A well-insulated bed could mean the difference between mild shivers and a cold so deep it cracked your dreams open. And it wasn't just about warmth. It was about rest. Real rest. Because tomorrow you'd need your hands steady, your legs strong, and your mind sharp. And you can't do that after a night spent wrestling cold demons in your sleep. One favourite trick among seasoned trappers was to sleep with tomorrow's clothes inside the bedding. Cold clothes can shock your system when you put them on. But if they're already warm, you start the day ahead. It might sound small, but out here, every degree counts. There's an ongoing scholarly debate, at least in the fringe corners of historical anthropology, about whether mountain men picked up these sleep strategies from Native American companions or developed them independently. It's likely a bit of both. The tribes of the north, Lakota, Crow, Shoshone, had mastered cold sleep long before trappers wandered in. They built shelters facing the right way, used animal hides in strategic layers, even placed hot coals in buried pots beneath sleeping mats. Mountain men weren't too proud to borrow what worked. Pride, like solitude, is a luxury the cold doesn't let you keep for long, so now picture it. You're curled into yourself like a comma in a sentence written in frost. Your blanket smells like smoke and wet leather, your rifle's warming against your ribs, and just beyond the fire's edge the wind howls like something ancient. But you're warm, for now, because you played your cards right. You didn't sleep like a hero, you slept like someone who plans to wake up. And out here, that's all that matters. The sun is up, but you'd barely know it. Light filters through the snow-heavy clouds like someone's holding a sheet of wax paper over the sky. Everything's white and grey and a little disorienting. You rub your eyes, step out of your shelter and immediately shield your face. It's not the cold that hits you first, it's the glare. Blinding. Like walking into a flashbulb. Snow stretches in every direction, smooth and shining and merciless. You squint, cover your face with your hand and mutter something profane. Because mountain men learned early, and often the hard way, that snow isn't just cold, it's bright. And if you're not prepared, that brightness can steal your sight right out from under you. We're talking snow blindness. an ancient, savage kind of eye burn caused not by the sun itself, but by its reflection on the snow. UV rays bounce off that white surface like daggers of light, blasting straight into your unprotected retinas, and you don't feel it right away. That's the worst part. You stumble around for hours thinking everything's fine, maybe a little too bright, maybe your eyes are tired. Then night falls, and the pain kicks in. Burning, stinging like your eyeballs have been sandpapered and left to dry. Vision blurs. Lids swell. In severe cases, you can't open your eyes at all. And out here, blindness, even temporary, is a death sentence wrapped in snow. You can't find your traps, can't light a fire, can't see where the trail ends and the cliff begins. Mountain men feared bears. Yes, feared frostbite, certainly. But snow blindness, that was a quiet, creeping horror that could end you without drawing blood. So they improvised. They built their own armour, makeshift goggles, primitive but effective. The Inuit and other native peoples of the Arctic had been crafting snow visors for centuries, carved from bone or wood, fitted with narrow slits that let in just enough light to see while shielding the eyes from the worst of the glare. Mountain men borrowed that wisdom and ran with it. Did their versions look elegant? Absolutely not. We're talking bark strips tied across the face, fur bands with slits cut out, even bits of soot smeared under the eyes to reduce glare, like nature's eye black. Some used scraps of leather with pinholes punched through. Others fashioned wire loops with dark cloth pulled tight like a tiny curtain. None of these were pretty, but they worked. And when your survival depends on your ability to see, fashion takes a backseat to function. There's one account, borderline folklore, of a trapper who made snow goggles from a broken tin cup. Cut it into strips, bent it around his face, and used pine pitch to hold it in place. His partner called him Iron Eyes for the rest of the season. He didn't care. He could still walk upright without smashing into trees. That was enough. Not every man got the memo, of course. Snow blindness hit the cocky ones, the careless ones, or the ones too proud to take advice. They'd squint all day with their hoods down, eyes wide, marvelling at the beautiful world around them, until nightfall. Then the real fun began. And you know what mountain men did to treat snow blindness? Nothing. There was no treatment, no drops, no hospitals. You just waited it out. Eyes shut, shivering, trying not to scream. Maybe someone would guide you around camp. Maybe you'd crawl. Maybe you'd lie in the snow for 2 days until your vision came back, praying it would come back. Even on cloudy days, the risk was real. UV light doesn't need direct sun to cause damage. That white blanket bouncing light up from below makes every direction an attack vector. And on high-altitude passes, it's even worse. The air is thinner, the light sharper. Some trappers reportedly wrapped scarves around their eyes with tiny peepholes just to navigate those stretches. Picture that, staggering across a snowy ridge, half blind on purpose just to avoid becoming fully blind later. There's a lesser-known fringe theory among wilderness historians that some mountain men developed light discipline for their eyes, closing one eye for stretches of time, rotating vision between the two, using eyelids like shutters to give each eye breaks. It sounds made up, but it's based on real practices used by desert nomads and Arctic travellers who learned to preserve their sight like they'd preserve a fire. Sight wasn't a given. It was a resource, and if you used too much of it too fast, it burned out. Modern gear has goggles with anti-fog coating, UV filters, amber lenses and straps that cost more than a horse used to. But out here, you had two options. Invent something or pay the price. So the mountain men got creative. They used what they had. If that meant squinting through a cracked piece of smoked glass held in a mittened hand, so be it. Vision was everything, and when you did get snow blindness, the only cure was rest. Darkness. Maybe a damp cloth. No camp chores. No hunting, just lying there, useless and humiliated, hoping your partner didn't decide to take your boots and leave you for dead. That happened too, by the way. If you were travelling in 2s or 3s and one man went blind, suddenly the trip doubled in difficulty. If you were lucky, your companions helped. If not, well, the snow has its secrets, and they're not all gentle. But when you planned right, when you wore your bark visor or soot-streaked goggles, when you turned your face away from glare and closed one eye on long stretches, you preserved your most important tool, not your rifle, not your traps, your eyes, because without them the world turns deadly fast. One white blur, no contrast, no shadows, and the next step you take might be your last. So the next time you squint into winter sun while driving, or curse the snow for being too bright, remember this. Once upon a time, a man tied a strip of leather across his face, cut 2 slits in it with his knife, and stepped into a white hell with nothing but instinct and hope. He didn't look good doing it, but he saw the way through. He crouched beside the fire, feeding it another chunk of half-dry wood, watching the flames sputter and lick up the bark like a starving dog. You think about tossing on more fuel, getting it really roaring, something primal and glorious like those bonfires from campgrounds or summer beach nights. But out here, in the raw grip of winter surrounded by snow and silence, mountain men would have looked at that oversized blaze and shaken their heads, because they knew the truth, one most of us have forgotten, the myth of the roaring fire. Out here, big fire doesn't mean better, it means reckless, wasteful, even dangerous. The mountain men weren't building fires to toast marshmallows or impress dates, they were building them to survive. And a survival fire? It's quiet, small, efficient, the kind that glows more than it blazes, that doesn't announce itself to every predator, 2-legged or 4-legged, within a mile. The kind that warms you without eating through your fuel pile in 20 minutes. The Hollywood version of the frontier shows men dancing around fires 5 feet high, their silhouettes flickering like myth. The real version? A man hunched low over a fire no wider than a dinner plate, nursing it like a newborn, coaxing heat instead of chasing spectacle. Because the louder a fire burns, the faster it dies. And in a world where every stick of wood had to be found, chopped, dried, and dragged back to camp by hand, no one was burning anything extra. Mountain men knew how to build a fire, sure, but more importantly, they knew how to manage one. The trick was keeping it just hot enough to boil snow for water, cook a bit of meat, dry your socks, and warm your hands, without wasting precious wood or overheating your shelter. Because once you got too warm, you started to sweat. And we've already covered that little death spiral, sweat kills. There's a clever fringe technique that old trappers used, passed down more like superstition than survival science. The 3-log fire. Just 3 pieces of wood, no more. You stack them with intention, one on the bottom to catch coals, one across the top to feed flames, and one as a diagonal lean-to control airflow. It's not flashy. It doesn't throw sparks into the stars, but it works. The coals stay hot for hours. You can warm food, dry gloves, and even reheat stones for your bedroll, all from a fire barely larger than your hat. Now, fire does give comfort. It gives morale. It reminds you you're not completely at the mercy of the wilderness. But mountain men had to balance that comfort with risk. Big flames drew attention, from hostile animals, yes, but also from other humans. Fires could be seen from ridges. Smoke could hang in the air and act like a trail marker. So unless you wanted company, you kept it low. You used dry wood to reduce smoke. You dug fire pits. You shielded the flame with rocks or snow walls. There's a story of a trapper named Milo who claimed he could cook a full meal with a fire the size of a squirrel's nest. Built it under a split log, lined the base with stones, and used a thin twig spit balanced on a pair of notches. He stayed unseen while others drew attention. He lived long enough to write about it. Sometimes the smallest fires protect the biggest lives. Another trick, banking coals. You don't start a new fire every morning if you're smart. You bank the embers overnight, bury them in ash or pack them in green moss, even wrap them in bark and store them in a pouch. In the morning you dig them out, breathe gently, add a bit of tinder, and the fire comes back to life like a sleeping dog that hears its name. This wasn't just convenient, it was life-saving. Starting fire from scratch in wet, windy, frigid weather was hard, even for veterans. If you could skip that struggle, you did. And speaking of fire starting, forget matches. Most of the time, mountain men carried a tinder kit, steel, flint, charcloth, and a wad of dry fibres or birch bark. You struck sparks, caught them on the char, and coaxed them into flame with breath and patience. In snowstorms, it was brutal. But once the fire was going, it wasn't something you took for granted. You guarded it, protected it from wind, snow, and your own clumsiness. There's an old trapper saying, one of those half-joking, fully serious pieces of wisdom, a man who loses his fire loses his future. It wasn't a metaphor. You let your fire die in the middle of the night, and you might not get it back. Cold fingers, wet tinder, failing light. It doesn't take much for things to go south. Mountain men slept light. They woke up often to feed the flame, sometimes tossing on bark or small chips just to keep it from vanishing. And fire wasn't just about warmth. It was utility. You used it to melt snow for water, soften hide for repair, cook fat for energy, sterilize wounds if things got desperate. It was your multi-tool, your partner, your last defense against the unrelenting indifference of nature. But again, it didn't have to roar to work. There's a scholarly debate floating around about whether some trappers suffered long-term effects from inhaling too much smoke during their lifetimes. After all, low fires mean you're often crouched right in the smoke zone, breathing in all that creosote and ash. It probably didn't help. But when the choice is smoke lung or frozen feet, you don't really stop to weigh the long-term consequences. You just stoke the coals and keep going. So now, as you sit in your warm home, maybe staring at your gas fireplace or turning up the thermostat a notch, think about this. A man, alone in the mountains, feeding a thumb-sized flame with careful fingers, wrapping his bedroll tighter around his knees. Not because he's weak, but because he's wise. Big fires are for parties. Out here, a little flame can light a very long night. You're staring into the trees, watching the snow fall so slowly it's like time itself is stuck. The wind's died down. No birds, no rustle of fur through the underbrush, no sound except the soft whisper of flakes landing on pine needles, like ash settling after a fire. And you realise something strange. You don't know how long you've been sitting here. 10 minutes? 40? An hour? Your thoughts are sluggish, fingers stiff but not quite painful. You blink and realise your breath has slowed to almost nothing. You're not cold exactly, just drifting. And this, right here, is one of the most dangerous truths mountain men knew. The one most people today don't believe until it's too late. In the deep cold, even time freezes. You don't feel yourself slipping. That's the trick. That's the danger. In freezing conditions, your body doesn't scream. It whispers. First, your extremities go. Fingers, toes, the tip of your nose. But what really starts to go next isn't your skin. It's your sense of time, your connection to reality. Mountain men called it losing the clock. Because out here, when the cold settles into your bones, time doesn't just slow down, it stops keeping track. That's why they watch the sun like hawks, not just for light, not just for travel, but to orient themselves in the blur. They could tell how long it had been since they last ate by the angle of the shadows. They checked the fire every time they came back from a thought, and they never let themselves just rest for a moment, unless they knew exactly when they sat down. Because the snow will lull you. It will rock you gently and wrap around you like a warm blanket made of lies. There are stories, hundreds of them, about trappers who sat too long on a stump or leaned against a tree after a hard day's travel, meaning to catch their breath for 5 minutes, and woke up 3 hours later, barely alive, or not at all. One man left camp to fetch water before dusk. He was found the next morning upright, leaning on his pole like he'd just paused mid-step, his face peaceful. He'd frozen where he stood, lost track of time, and drifted off into sleep before he even knew he was tired. See, cold doesn't just attack the body, it attacks perception. You think slower, move slower, your judgment narrows, and your internal clock? Useless. In deep freeze, minutes feel like hours, or they vanish entirely. You could be wandering in circles for 20 minutes and swear it's only been 5, or sit in camp staring at the fire and lose 2 hours to blank thought. It's not stupidity, it's biology. The body conserves energy by downshifting brain function. The colder you get, the dumber you become. Mountain men knew this, not in clinical terms but in experience. They built time habits into their days. They moved on routine. If they stopped to rest, they'd pace afterward, force themselves to speak aloud, count breaths, recite old songs just to keep the mind awake. Some used crude hour markers, snow melting on a rock, shadows moving across a camp post, even the burn rate of a certain type of wood. When the pine splits, stir the stew, that sort of thing. And then there's the memory problem. One of the stranger effects of prolonged cold exposure is the way it messes with recall. Some men reported losing hours or even days in bad weather, not from injury or sleep, just from mental shutdown. You'd get to a camp, unload your gear, and suddenly realise you couldn't remember setting the last 3 traps, or how long you'd walked, or whether you'd eaten. And if you were alone, there was no one to check you. That's why some trappers kept rudimentary journals, scratched into bark, stone, or rawhide. Not for posterity, for reminders, to hold on to a timeline when the cold tried to erase it. There's even a fringe theory among wilderness historians that this time distortion is part of why so many solo trappers told tall tales when they got back to civilization. Not because they were lying, because they couldn't actually tell how long things took. A 1-hour blizzard might have felt like an all-day siege. A 3-day trek could have blurred into one continuous surreal march through white silence. You lose context out here, and once it's gone, the mind fills in gaps with stories. One solution the mountain men leaned on: companions, not just for safety or warmth, but for mental anchoring. Someone to say, "We've been walking for an hour," or "You already ate." Someone to argue with about when the sun dipped. Even when they fought, trappers rarely stayed alone for long stretches unless they had no choice. Not because they were lonely, because they needed someone else's perception to ground their own. When they were alone, they got creative. Some trappers talked to themselves constantly, narrated their actions, recited poetry, sang songs, anything to keep the brain moving in a rhythm. Others created fake schedules. At every 10th step, check the sky, or, after 10 wood chips, stir the coals. That sounds ridiculous in a modern setting, but when your brain's moving through molasses and the forest has gone silent and you're pretty sure you've had the same thought 8 times in a row, these tricks save you. There's a somber passage from a French trapper's journal, circa 1839. "I am alone in a land without clocks. The sky gives no hour. The snow covers my tracks. I sleep and wake, and cannot tell which is which." He made it out, but just barely. Spent a week in a cabin talking to the fire like it was a friend. He wrote those words to remind himself that the mind, not the cold, was the first thing to fail. So here you are, still in your shelter, fire burning low, snow falling steady. You check your gear, you eat a little, you speak aloud. Don't fall asleep yet. Not because you're tired, but because the quiet is beginning to feel too comfortable. That's the signal. You move, because the cold can't take you if you stay awake. And if you can hold on to time, just enough to remember what you're doing, you'll see another morning. Maybe you won't remember how long the night was, but you'll remember you beat it. You're moving again. The storm's past, and there's that weird glowing stillness after snow, where everything's clean, but also eerily quiet, like the world's holding its breath. Your boots crunch on the crusted snow. The cold is back to being sharp instead of suffocating, and your thoughts are clearer than they've been in days. You walk, scanning the white hills, the naked trees, the distant line of mountains, and you start to think about why you're still here. Not just today, but across it all. How the mountain men managed to survive in conditions that chew through modern hikers with state-of-the-art gear and satellite phones. The truth is, we've forgotten what they knew. Or maybe we chose to forget. But that knowledge, that deep bone-level understanding of how to live with cold instead of against it, it still matters. It always will. Because here's the thing. Mountain men weren't born knowing how to survive sub-zero nights, frozen rivers, and months of solitude. They learned, through bruises, through frostbite, through pure trial and error, and what they learned, again and again, was that nature isn't here to save you. The snow doesn't care. The cold doesn't listen to apologies. If you mess up, it will take a piece of you. Maybe a toe, maybe a memory, maybe your last breath. But if you pay attention, really pay attention, it also teaches you how to survive. They knew fire was a tool, not a crutch. That sweat could kill you faster than hunger. That fat wasn't a luxury, but fuel. They understood that your body doesn't lie out here. If you're shivering, it's talking to you. If your fingers are numb, it's a warning, not a suggestion. You either listen or you pay. The wilderness doesn't negotiate. But they also knew the cold wasn't the enemy. That's something modern folks get wrong all the time. We act like cold is some kind of monster. But mountain men didn't fear it the way we do. They respected it, worked with it. They used snow to insulate their shelters, ice to store meat, frost to track game. They didn't just fight the elements, they partnered with them. And maybe that's what we've really forgotten. The idea that cold isn't something to beat, it's something to understand. That understanding came through experience, sure, but also through observation, watching animals, watching each other, remembering what worked and what didn't. You made mistakes once, only once. The man who fell asleep too close to the fire and scorched his blanket didn't do it again. The one who ignored frostbite signs and lost 3 fingers, he became a cautionary tale. Learning wasn't optional, and pride got buried under 6 feet of snow with a nice view and no headstone. there's a reason so many of these techniques have faded. Convenience, comfort, central heating, insulated jackets, microwave dinners. We don't need to know how to read shadow patterns in snow or use tallow to seal our boots. Not in most places, but comfort dulls awareness. It numbs instincts that once kept us alive. And when comfort fails, when the power's out, or the car breaks down in a storm, or you find yourself a little too far from the trail, you realise just how little modern knowledge can help. The old ways weren't romantic. They were raw, dirty, violent sometimes, but they were honest. Mountain men didn't pretend to master nature. They knew they were guests, temporary tenants in a world far bigger, far colder, far more indifferent than any society they'd left behind. And that humility, that's the foundation of all real survival. There's one last odd little fringe fact that often gets overlooked in retellings of their lives. Many mountain men didn't want to return to civilization. They didn't miss it. After years in the cold, after learning how to live with the land instead of in spite of it, they found towns and cities loud, confusing, and full of soft people with too many opinions. They felt more at home beside a fire in a snow-covered gulch than in a warm bed under a roof. Some tried to go back and didn't last a week. Because once you learn what the cold teaches, you can't unlearn it. You move slower, think longer, appreciate the things that matter. Warmth, food, companionship, dry socks. You don't waste time worrying about the things you can't control. You just adapt, survive, live. We've lost a lot of that, forgotten it in favour of convenience and control. But not all of it is gone. It lives in the way you instinctively cup your hands over your coffee, in the way you know to layer clothes instead of just throwing on the thickest jacket, in the satisfaction of building a fire, even if it's in a backyard pit, not a blizzard-struck forest. The wisdom isn't dead, it's dormant, waiting for us to remember. So now, as you stand in this silent, frozen place, impossibly quiet, impossibly cold, but somehow still alive, you know more than you did. Not just facts, but truths. The kind of truths that settle into your bones and change the way you see winter, survival, and even yourself. The mountain men didn't have degrees, they didn't have GPS, they didn't have backup plans, but they had fire, they had instincts, they had a deep, grudging respect for the cold that most of us have traded for central heating. Maybe we'll never live the way they did, maybe we don't need to. But the lessons are still there, etched into the snow, the ice, the quiet. Start your fire first, don't sweat, eat fat, make camp before sunset, trust your shiver, sleep like your life depends on it, because it does. Watch the snow, listen to the silence, protect your vision, move before the dark takes you, and remember that time, like heat, will vanish if you don't guard it. It's all still there, we just forgot. Now you remember, you did it, you made it to the end, 30 nights of cold, 30 lessons from the edge of frost and fire, and now you get to rest. Not just because the fire's crackling low or the night's gone quiet again, but because something's settled inside you. A small, flickering thing that wasn't there before. Not just knowledge, understanding. This wasn't a survival manual, not really. It was a remembering. A long exhale across time through the crackle of pine knots and the hush of snowfall. You saw what it meant to be vulnerable in the cold, to accept it, to adapt to it, to lean into discomfort and find, somehow, a rhythm that keeps you breathing, thinking, moving. Because the old ways weren't just tricks. They were a mindset. A way of seeing cold not as punishment, but as invitation. Not to suffer, but to pay attention. That's what the mountain men had that we lost. Not better gear, not stronger wills, just sharper focus, fewer distractions, closer connection to what mattered when the wind picked up and the snow started to fall sideways. So take this with you, into winter, into life. Whether you're out on a frozen trail or just facing your own kind of storm, remember how to breathe steady, how to move with purpose, how to warm the small fire inside you when everything else feels like ice. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find that the old knowledge wasn't lost. It was just waiting, quiet, like a coal under ash, ready when you are.